Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In the quiet, suburban town of Marlow Heights, Maryland, a string of violent bank robberies had begun to rattle the community. The mastermind behind these brazen acts was a man named Vinny Harper. Known to many as an unassuming mechanic who lived a quiet life, Vinny was the last person anyone would suspect of being involved in any criminal activity. Yet, behind the scenes, he had been carefully planning his descent into a life of crime. Vinny had grown up in the rougher neighborhoods of Baltimore, where crime was often a way of life for those who didn't have many options. He had spent his youth navigating a world of drugs, violence, and broken dreams. But Vinny managed to escape the worst of it, moving to Marlow Heights to rebuild his life. He got a steady job at a local auto repair shop and tried to distance himself from the criminals he had once known. However, as the years passed, his financial struggles began to mount. His debts piled up, his car repair business barely making enough to cover expenses, and his life seemed to be stagnating in a town that promised more than it could deliver. It was during one particularly dark stretch of his life that Vinny met a former associate, Greg the Snake Lawson, a man whose reputation as a criminal mastermind preceded him. Greg had been involved in everything from car thefts to armed robberies, and it didn't take long for him to rekindle their old friendship. Greg, with his cold and calculating demeanor, noticed Vinny's desperation and suggested a partnership. He saw potential in Vinny, someone with a steady hand who could be molded into a proficient criminal. Together, they could pull off the kind of high-profile robberies that would set them up for life. The plan was simple. Vinny and Greg would rob a series of local banks, using firearms to intimidate the tellers and customers. They would wear masks, ensuring that their identities remained concealed, and in the confusion, grab the cash before anyone could react. Vinny, having worked with cars his whole life, used his knowledge to acquire the perfect getaway vehicle, an unassuming white van that would blend into the crowd. They made sure to avoid any advanced technology that might track them, using payphones and burner phones to make contact with their partners. The first robbery occurred in late November 2019 at a small bank in downtown Marlow Heights. The security cameras captured the masked figures entering the bank with military precision, their faces hidden behind ski masks. Vinny was the one to brandish the firearm, a Glock 19, which he'd purchased off the black market. The heist was a success. They were in and out within minutes, walking away with over $100,000 in cash. The plan had gone off without a hitch. In the days following the robbery, Vinny and Greg kept their heads low, laying low in an apartment Greg had secured in a nearby city. The thrill of the heist, the adrenaline rush, was intoxicating. It was unlike anything Vinny had ever experienced. His mundane life as a mechanic seemed so distant now, and the money had temporarily lifted the weight of his mounting debts. He knew, however, that they couldn't stop here. They needed to strike again, and quickly. The next bank they targeted was in a more affluent part of the town. This time, they took a bolder approach. The bank was busier, and there was a heightened sense of security, but Vinny had already thought of everything. He had spent hours studying the bank's security measures, learning the routines of the employees and the placement of the security cameras. The second robbery was executed with the same precision as the first, but this time, they had a more sophisticated getaway plan. They didn't just take the van. They used a set of stolen license plates to switch vehicles at a nearby parking lot, making it even harder for the authorities to track them. But despite their careful planning, something was beginning to go wrong. The police, although unable to identify the perpetrators, had begun to notice a pattern. The same weapons were used in both robberies, and the similarities in the approach and timing couldn't be ignored. Detective Clara Hernandez, a seasoned investigator with the local police department, had been assigned to the case. She wasn't one to be easily fooled, and she quickly put together a profile of the robbers, focusing on their use of firearms and the consistent getaway tactics. As the weeks went by, the heat was starting to build. Vinny felt the pressure mounting. Greg, on the other hand, seemed more confident, almost cocky, as though they had already gotten away with the perfect crime. But Vinny began to question whether he could keep up this lifestyle. His conscience was starting to eat at him, and the thought of getting caught weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just the law he feared, it was the possibility of losing everything: his quiet life, his family, and the future he had worked so hard to rebuild. Yet, despite his growing reservations, Vinny couldn't back out now. He knew that Greg wouldn't hesitate to cut ties with him if he showed any signs of weakness. They were in too deep, and the lure of easy money had become too powerful to resist. The next robbery was scheduled for early February 2020, and this time, it would be their biggest job yet. But as they prepared for their third heist, fate would take an unexpected turn. As Vinny and Greg set their sights on a larger, more secure bank located in the heart of Washington, D.C., tensions began to rise. This was a different kind of heist. They had meticulously planned every detail, but even the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. Greg had arranged for an insider to work at the bank, a janitor who had access to the vault and who had agreed to turn a blind eye to their actions in exchange for a cut of the money. This was their most ambitious plan yet, and Vinny felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The day of the heist arrived, and Vinny's nerves were on edge. He tried to push the anxiety aside, reminding himself that they had done this before. But something was different this time. The city felt more alive than usual, the streets busier, the air thicker with the sense of impending danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that their every move was being tracked. But Greg, ever the optimist, reassured him. "We've got this, Vinny," Greg said, his voice calm, almost reassuring. "This is going to be our big one. We'll be out in minutes. Trust me." Vinny tried to relax as they approached the bank. The plan was simple. Greg would enter the bank first and distract the security guards, while Vinny followed close behind, armed with his Glock 19. The janitor, a middle-aged man named Robert, would let them into the vault, where they would take the money and escape through the back entrance. Everything was in place, and for a moment, Vinny almost believed that they might pull this off without a hitch. As they entered the bank, the familiar tension settled in. The sound of the door opening echoed in Vinny's mind as he followed Greg inside. The place was bustling with customers, all of them oblivious to the danger that lurked just beyond the door. Greg had already begun his distraction, chatting casually with one of the guards at the security desk. Vinny, his heart pounding, moved swiftly past the tellers, his eyes scanning the room. His fingers tightened around the grip of the Glock, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. They reached the vault area with minimal resistance. The janitor was already there, waiting for them, a nervous look on his face. Vinny could see the sweat on Robert's brow as he unlocked the vault. The moment the heavy door creaked open, a sense of relief washed over Vinny. They were so close now, just a few more minutes, and they would be out of here, free with the money. But just as they began loading the cash into their bags, the unthinkable happened. A loud siren blared across the bank, echoing through the halls. Vinny froze, his breath catching in his throat. The vault door slammed shut with a deafening thud, trapping them inside. Panic surged through him as he glanced at Greg, whose face had gone pale. It was too late to escape. They were locked in. "Shit," Greg muttered under his breath. What the hell happened? Vinny's mind raced. He quickly realized that something had gone wrong. Someone must have tipped off the authorities. Their careful planning had crumbled in an instant. The sirens grew louder, and the sound of approaching police cars could be heard from the street. Time was running out, and Vinny's heart began to race. "We need to move now," he hissed, grabbing the nearest bag of cash and pushing past Greg. They rushed for the back exit, but as they neared the door, it was too late. The police had already surrounded the building. Vinny could hear the faint sound of footsteps, the shuffling of officers as they took positions. The weight of the situation was suffocating. He had gone from feeling in control to completely powerless in a matter of seconds. The adrenaline that had fueled him just moments before now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Greg cursed, his hand darting for the back door, but before he could even reach it, a voice came through the loudspeaker. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground," the officer shouted. Vinny's stomach dropped. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. They had been caught. There was no way out. The officers moved in quickly, surrounding the area. Vinny and Greg were forced to surrender, their hands raised in the air. Vinny's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear. His life, as he knew it, was over. In the aftermath, the investigation revealed that Greg had been the one to make the fatal mistake. His overconfidence had led them into a trap, and the tip-off had come from someone within their own circle. Robert, the janitor, had betrayed them in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the authorities had been waiting for them when they made their move. The robbery had been meticulously planned, but in the end, it was the smallest mistake that led to their downfall. Vinny's arrest made headlines across the country, a cautionary tale of how even the most careful plans could be undone by a single error. As the days turned into weeks, and the court cases dragged on, Vinny realized the true cost of his decisions. The money, the thrill, the false sense of security, it all came crashing down. He had lost his freedom, and more importantly, his chance at redemption. The quiet life he had once dreamed of was now nothing more than a distant memory, a casualty of the choices he had made. As he sat in his cell, waiting for his trial, Vinny couldn't help but wonder how he had gotten to this point. The man he had once been, the mechanic with big dreams and a hope for a better life, seemed so far removed from the criminal he had become. And yet, deep down, he knew that he had made his own choices. The consequences were his to bear. Months passed as Vinny sat in his cell, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. The once quiet and humble mechanic had become a criminal, driven by desperation, greed, and a false sense of invincibility. The thrill of the robberies, the money, and the adrenaline had clouded his judgment, blinding him to the inevitable consequences of his actions. Now he was left with the harsh reality of prison, and he had no one to blame but himself. As the days turned into weeks, Vinny's trial approached. The media coverage had been extensive, and he had become a symbol of how even the most ordinary of people could be pulled into a life of crime. The once respected mechanic, the man who had lived among the suburban families of Marlow Heights, was now a notorious criminal. His face appeared on TV screens and newspaper headlines, the story of his downfall serving as a cautionary tale for others. Greg, who had been arrested alongside Vinny, had taken a different approach. Greg had always been the more ruthless of the two, the one who had pushed for the robberies and had been the driving force behind their criminal endeavors. Unlike Vinny, Greg showed no remorse for his actions. He was prepared to face the consequences with a cold indifference, as if he had always known this would be his fate. Vinny, on the other hand, struggled with guilt. Every night, as he lay in his cell, he replayed the events of the robbery over and over in his mind. He thought about the people he had hurt, the bank employees who had been terrified, the families who had trusted him, and his own family, who had no idea what he had become. His mother, who had always been proud of him, had visited him once, her face a mixture of disappointment and sadness. It had been the hardest thing Vinny had ever had to endure, seeing the pain he had caused her. His attorney, a public defender with little time to spare, had tried to negotiate a plea deal, hoping to secure a lesser sentence. But the charges against Vinny were serious, and the evidence was stacked against him. The authorities had gathered fingerprints from the bank, surveillance footage from the security cameras, and even phone records that linked him to Greg. The case was airtight, and Vinny knew that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The night before his trial, Vinny sat alone in his cell, staring out through the small window at the dark sky above. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who had dreamed of opening his own auto repair shop, of building a life away from crime. How had he fallen so far? How had he allowed himself to become the very thing he had once despised? He knew the answers now. It was the pressure, the desperation, the constant battle to stay afloat in a world that seemed to offer no other options. And it was the lure of easy money, the false belief that he could pull off one more job, just one last score, and then retire. But that dream had shattered the moment the sirens went off, the moment he realized they had been caught. The trial began the following morning, and Vinny sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by his legal team. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The prosecution presented their case, detailing the meticulous planning of the robberies and the overwhelming evidence against Vinny and Greg. They showed video footage of the robberies, including the moments when Vinny had brandished the weapon and ordered the tellers to fill the bags with money. It was clear from the footage that Vinny had been fully involved in the heists, his face obscured by the mask, but his stance and actions unmistakable. Vinny's defense attorney argued for leniency, citing his lack of prior criminal history and his cooperation with the investigation. But it was clear that the damage had been done. The jury deliberated for hours, and when the verdict was finally read, Vinny's heart sank. Guilty. The words echoed in his ears as he sat motionless, his hands trembling at his sides. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy anchor. He would have to serve time, and for the rest of his life, he would have to live with the knowledge that he had betrayed everything he had once stood for. In the months that followed, Vinny tried to adjust to life behind bars. Prison was a brutal place, a world where survival meant conforming to a harsh and unforgiving code. The inmates were ruthless, and Vinny quickly learned that in order to survive, he would have to keep his head down, avoid making waves, and stay out of trouble. But even as he adjusted to the prison environment, the guilt still gnawed at him. He couldn't escape the memories of the people he had hurt, and the thought of his family, especially his mother, haunted him every day. During his time in prison, Vinny began to do something he had never done before. He started reading. At first, it was a way to pass the time, but over time, the books began to provide him with something more. They gave him an escape from the harsh reality of his surroundings and allowed him to reflect on his past. He read about redemption, about people who had turned their lives around after making grave mistakes. It gave him a glimmer of hope, a small but important realization that he could still change, that he didn't have to be defined by the mistakes he had made. But that hope was tested when he learned that Greg, the man who had been his partner in crime, was making moves to cut ties with him. Greg had been offered a plea deal, a chance to reduce his sentence in exchange for cooperating with the authorities and providing information on other criminal activities. It was a betrayal, and it stung deeply. Vinny had always known that Greg was ruthless, but seeing him throw him under the bus for a reduced sentence made the betrayal feel all the more personal. The pain of that betrayal was compounded by the ongoing sense of isolation that came with prison life. Vinny realized that he had no one left, no friends, no family, and no hope of ever returning to the life he had once known. The world he had built had been destroyed by his own hands, and now, all he had was time to think, to regret, and to wonder if it was too late to make things right. Case 2. Logan Pierce had spent most of his life chasing a dream that never seemed to materialize. Born and raised in the outskirts of Detroit, he grew up in a broken home, bouncing between foster care and juvenile detention. By the time he was 20, he had already racked up an extensive criminal record: armed robbery, grand theft auto, and illegal weapons possession. Prison had become a second home, and after serving 5 years for an attempted carjacking, he was released with nothing but a parole officer watching his every move. But Logan had no plans to go straight. In late 2021, Logan reconnected with an old friend, Tyler Vance, a former military dropout who had turned to the criminal underworld to make ends meet. Tyler had contacts within an illegal gun-running operation, and together, they hatched a plan to steal a massive cache of firearms from a small but well-stocked gun store in rural Missouri. The target, Patriot Arms and Supplies, was known for selling high-powered rifles and tactical equipment to local militias and survivalists. It was a prime target, but it wasn't going to be easy. The heist was planned for December 17th, a cold and foggy night when visibility was low, and most of the town would be asleep. Logan and Tyler, along with 2 other associates, Devin Brooks and Eric Riggs Rigsby, arrived in a stolen van just after midnight. The store was equipped with an alarm system, but Tyler had procured an electronic jammer that would disable any outgoing signals for at least 15 minutes, just enough time to break in, load up, and vanish into the darkness. Using a crowbar, Logan pried open the side door while Riggs kept watch. Inside, rows of assault rifles, handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition lined the shelves. The group moved fast, stuffing duffel bags with as many weapons as they could carry. Devin focused on the safe, using an industrial drill to breach the lock and access the store's most valuable inventory: customized sniper rifles and rare firearms worth tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. But what they didn't know was that the store's owner, a former law enforcement officer named Hank Lawson, had been sleeping in the back room with a shotgun by his side. The sound of drilling had woken him, and by the time he stepped out, the gang was already halfway through their haul. Hank, realizing what was happening, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Chaos erupted. Logan and his crew panicked. Tyler grabbed a handgun and fired back, hitting Hank in the shoulder. The blast sent him crashing against a shelf, knocking over boxes of ammunition. In the confusion, Devin dropped his tools and bolted for the exit, but Riggs, always the most reckless of the group, decided to stand his ground. He fired 2 shots, forcing Hank to retreat into the back office. With sirens now wailing in the distance, proof that their jammer hadn't worked as long as they'd hoped, the crew knew they had to flee. Logan grabbed the nearest bag and sprinted for the van, Tyler following close behind. Riggs, however, was too slow. As he turned to run, Hank emerged from cover and fired a single shot, striking Riggs in the leg. He collapsed just as the van peeled out of the parking lot, leaving him behind. The police arrived within minutes, finding Riggs bleeding out on the floor. Under interrogation, he quickly folded, giving up the names of his accomplices. A statewide manhunt was launched, and within 48 hours, Devin was arrested at a motel outside St. Louis. Tyler was found 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned warehouse with a portion of the stolen weapons. Logan, however, managed to evade capture longer than anyone expected. Using fake identities and burner phones, he moved between cities, selling off stolen firearms to underground buyers. But law enforcement was relentless. With federal agencies now involved, Logan's days were numbered. On January 5, 2022, after weeks on the run, he was finally tracked to a cheap motel in Oklahoma. A SWAT team surrounded the building, cutting off all exits. Logan, realizing there was no way out, surrendered without a fight. In court, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, Riggs' testimony, and the recovered weapons all sealed his fate. Logan Pierce was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, another criminal who had gambled for a big payday and lost. The failed heist became another cautionary tale in the growing epidemic of illegal gun trafficking in the U.S. A stark reminder that even the best-laid plans could unravel in an instant. In the weeks following the arrest of Logan Pierce, federal investigators worked to uncover the full extent of the stolen firearms operation. The robbery at Patriot Arms and Supplies was more than just a failed heist. It was a window into a much larger underground network. The stolen guns had already begun circulating on the black market, and law enforcement feared they would be used in violent crimes if they weren't recovered quickly. While Logan sat in a high-security holding facility awaiting trial, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, launched a multi-state crackdown on suspected weapons traffickers. Their first priority was tracking down the missing inventory from the robbery. Although Tyler Vance had been caught with a portion of the stolen guns, hundreds were still unaccounted for. The investigation took an unexpected turn when they discovered that Devin Brooks, the gang member who had fled the scene first, had managed to sell a significant portion of the weapons before his capture. Devin, who had connections in the Chicago underworld, had arranged a deal with a high-profile arms dealer known only as Kingston, a notorious figure with ties to gang violence in the Midwest. As federal agents pieced together the timeline, they realized that some of the stolen firearms had already been used in violent crimes. A Glock 19 with a scratched-off serial number, taken directly from the store's shelves, was linked to a fatal shooting in Kansas City just days after the heist. Another firearm, a modified AR-15, was seized during a drug raid in Indianapolis. The urgency to track down the remaining weapons intensified. Logan's interrogation. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Logan refused to cooperate with authorities. He knew that testifying against Kingston or other high-level arms traffickers could mean a death sentence, even behind bars. But as prosecutors built their case, they didn't need Logan's confession. His fingerprints were found on multiple stolen weapons, and his name was connected to burner phone records used to communicate with buyers. Even more damning, an anonymous informant inside the Oklahoma City jail tipped off federal agents about a $50,000 bounty placed on Logan's head by Kingston's network. It was clear that even in custody, Logan was still a liability to the people he had worked with. Realizing his life was in danger, Logan reluctantly agreed to a plea deal. He would provide detailed information on how the stolen weapons were transported, who the buyers were, and which gun-running networks were involved. In exchange, he would avoid a life sentence and be placed in protective custody. Using Logan's testimony, the ATF orchestrated an undercover sting operation targeting Kingston's associates. Agents posing as arms dealers set up a fake buy, luring members of the trafficking ring into a warehouse in Memphis. On the night of the transaction, the warehouse was surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. The bust resulted in 8 arrests and the seizure of over 200 firearms, including some of the remaining guns stolen from Patriot Arms. Kingston himself, however, was not present. He had disappeared weeks earlier, likely tipped off by a corrupt informant. The case against him remained open, but his absence only fueled his legend in the criminal underworld. Sentencing and final judgment. By the time Logan's trial concluded in late 2022, he had already been branded as a traitor in the criminal world. His cooperation with authorities had earned him a reduced sentence, but it had also placed a permanent target on his back. Final sentence. Logan Pierce, 35 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Tyler Vance, 40 years without parole. Devin Brooks, 25 years with additional charges for illegal firearm distribution. Eric Riggs Rigsby, 18 years for his role in the robbery and assault on a store owner. Even behind bars, Logan knew he would never be truly safe. The criminal network he once served had turned against him, and every day in prison was a reminder of the life he had lost. Meanwhile, the ATF continued their hunt for Kingston, knowing that as long as he remained free, the illegal arms trade would continue. For Logan Pierce, the heist had been a last-ditch effort at fortune and power, but in the end, it only sealed his fate as another lost soul in the system. Despite the successful sting operation and the arrests of Logan Pierce and his crew, the case was far from over. Kingston, the elusive arms dealer, remained at large, and federal authorities feared that his network was still operational. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, formed a joint task force with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and U.S. Marshals to track down Kingston before he could disappear permanently. His last known whereabouts placed him in Atlanta, Georgia, but investigators suspected that he had fled overseas, possibly to Mexico or South America, where he had connections to major drug cartels. Meanwhile, law enforcement began interrogating the men already in custody, hoping to uncover any lead that would bring Kingston down. Most of them refused to speak, knowing that any information they provided could lead to a death sentence from Kingston's enforcers. However, one low-level associate, Darius D'Lo Carter, decided to cooperate. D'Lo had been a runner for Kingston's organization, transporting illegal firearms across state lines. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he gave investigators a key piece of information. Kingston had a safe house in Miami, where he frequently stayed before heading to the Caribbean to escape law enforcement crackdowns. Acting on this intelligence, the Joint Task Force organized a raid on the safe house, hoping to catch Kingston before he could vanish once again. On the night of November 18, 2022, a SWAT team surrounded a luxury condominium in downtown Miami, where Kingston was believed to be hiding. Using a no-knock warrant, the agents breached the door and stormed inside. The scene inside was far more elaborate than they had expected. The penthouse had been stripped of any personal belongings, indicating that Kingston had already fled. However, what they did find was just as valuable: a laptop, burner phones, and a stash of fake passports under different aliases. Investigators quickly analyzed the laptop, uncovering financial records, offshore bank accounts, and coded messages between Kingston and his cartel contacts. One encrypted message stood out: headed south. Business as usual. We'll check in when clear. This single message confirmed their worst fear. Kingston was on the move again, likely en route to Colombia or Venezuela, where extradition would be difficult. While Kingston remained a fugitive, the U.S. government began using the recovered data to dismantle his entire operation. Federal authorities traced his financial transactions to shell companies in Panama, which were used to launder money from arms sales. They also discovered that Kingston had military-grade weapons in his possession, including customized sniper rifles and high-capacity magazines, many of which were believed to be stolen from military bases. This revelation led to an internal investigation within the U.S. military, exposing a black market pipeline that had been leaking weapons into criminal organizations. Several corrupt military personnel were arrested, and Kingston's supply chain began to collapse. However, Kingston himself remained a ghost, moving from one country to another, always one step ahead of the law. Back in the United States, Logan Pierce was learning the harsh realities of life in prison. Despite his plea deal, Logan was a marked man. Word had spread quickly that he had cooperated with the authorities, and in the world of organized crime, that was a death sentence. He was placed in protective custody, but even that couldn't shield him from the constant threats. Inmates loyal to Kingston and other gun-running networks saw him as a traitor, and within months of his incarceration, he had already survived multiple attempts on his life. In January 2023, Logan was nearly stabbed in the prison yard, but the attacker was intercepted at the last moment by guards. In March 2023, he was found unconscious in his cell, likely from an attempted poisoning, though no evidence was found. By May 2023, he had been transferred twice to different federal facilities, each time due to security concerns. Despite the constant danger, Logan had one last card to play. Facing the reality that he would never survive in general population, Logan made a desperate decision. He would give up everything on Kingston in exchange for entry into the Witness Protection Program. His lawyers arranged a final debriefing with federal agents, where he laid out the full structure of Kingston's network, naming corrupt officials, cartel connections, and even safe houses that had not yet been discovered. The information was explosive. Federal authorities now had a new roadmap to track Kingston down, and with each revelation, they closed in on him. Logan, meanwhile, was quietly moved out of federal prison and into a secure government facility, awaiting his new identity and relocation. Despite the new intelligence, Kingston remained at large. The ATF and FBI expanded their international efforts, working with Interpol and Latin American law enforcement agencies to track down Kingston's whereabouts. His criminal empire was collapsing, and the walls were closing in. But Kingston was no ordinary arms dealer. He was a survivor, a man who had evaded capture for over a decade. Even as authorities got closer, the question remained, would they catch him before he disappeared forever, or was Kingston simply too powerful to fall? Case 3. Marcus Mack. Holloway had spent most of his life navigating the underbelly of Detroit's crime scene. Born into a family with a history of petty crime, Mack never had a chance at a normal life. By the time he was 18, he had already served time in juvenile detention for robbery. By 25, he had built a reputation as a streetwise enforcer, dealing in stolen goods, running small-time scams, and acting as muscle for local gangs. But that was never enough for him. Mack wanted something bigger. He wanted the kind of score that would set him up for life. And in 2017, he saw his opportunity. It was a firearms warehouse on the outskirts of Toledo, Ohio. The facility, operated by a licensed dealer, stored hundreds of weapons, handguns, shotguns, and even military-style rifles. These weren't just any firearms. Many were high-value, sought-after models that could be flipped on the black market for a fortune. Mack had inside information from an ex-employee who owed him money. Security was tight but predictable, with a single guard patrolling the premises and an alarm system that had a 2-minute delay before alerting authorities. Mack assembled a team of 3 men: Deshaun Carter, a former gang associate with a history of burglaries; Luis Ortega, a getaway driver who specialized in high-speed chases; and Aaron Reaper Mills, a wild card, ruthless and unpredictable, but experienced in breaking into high-security buildings. Their plan was simple but brutal. They would hit the warehouse in the dead of night, neutralize the guard, and clear out as many firearms as possible before the cops could respond. On the night of December 14, 2017, they moved in. Dressed in dark clothing and wearing gloves, they cut the chain-link fence surrounding the facility. Luis stayed in the van, engine running, while the others crept toward the loading dock. The guard, an older man in his late 50s, was making his rounds when Mack struck from behind, knocking him unconscious with the butt of his pistol. They dragged him inside and zip-tied his hands before proceeding with the heist. Aaron used a crowbar to pry open the storage room door, while Mack and Deshaun began loading crates into a dolly. Inside the crates were semi-automatic pistols, high-powered rifles, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Within 10 minutes, they had filled the van with nearly 70 firearms and several cases of ammunition. Enough firepower to equip an entire street gang. But they had made one mistake. The guard, despite being tied up, had managed to trigger a silent alarm. Unbeknownst to them, police units were already en route. As Mack and his crew made their way back to the van, the flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. The sound of sirens shattered the silence of the industrial district. Luis floored the gas pedal before everyone was fully inside, nearly sending Deshaun tumbling out of the van. The police were closing in, and within seconds, the pursuit was on. The van barreled down the highway, swerving through lanes at reckless speeds. Inside, Mack and Aaron loaded rifles, preparing for the worst. As they approached an intersection, Luis attempted a sharp turn, but the van's back wheels skidded. The vehicle spun out of control and crashed into a concrete barrier. Before they could recover, squad cars surrounded them. With nowhere to run, Deshaun attempted to flee on foot, but was taken down by a police dog. Aaron opened fire in desperation, but officers quickly returned fire, striking him in the chest. Mack and Luis surrendered, hands raised as police dragged them from the wreckage. By morning, the heist had made headlines across the country. The stolen weapons were recovered, though authorities suspected some had already been moved to buyers before the bust. Mack was sentenced to 45 years in prison for armed robbery, weapons trafficking, and assault. The botched heist became one of the most infamous firearm thefts in Ohio's history, a failed attempt at a final payday that ended in blood and prison bars. In the aftermath of the heist, Authorities launched a full-scale investigation into how Marcus Mack Holloway and his crew had managed to orchestrate such a daring robbery. The Toledo police, working alongside the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, knew that recovering the stolen firearms was their top priority. Even though most of the weapons were found inside the wrecked van, a deeper look into Mack's criminal network suggested that some of the stolen inventory had already been pre-sold to underground buyers. In the weeks that followed, forensic experts combed through every piece of evidence at the warehouse and inside the getaway vehicle. Surveillance footage showed Mack's team moving with precision, indicating that they had spent weeks, if not months, planning the operation. The inside information they had received about the warehouse security system proved to be key, and investigators were eager to track down the source of that leak. Authorities traced the tip-off back to a former warehouse employee named Daniel Whitmore, who had been fired earlier that year for suspected theft. Under pressure, Whitmore admitted to selling security details to Mack for a few $1,000s, believing it was just another petty robbery. What he hadn't expected was for Mack and his crew to go after the firearms themselves. Now he found himself facing conspiracy charges, and rather than risk a lengthy prison sentence, he cooperated with investigators. Through Whitmore's testimony and seized phone records, law enforcement unraveled more details about Mack's broader criminal connections. It became clear that this heist wasn't just about making a quick profit. It was part of a larger underground gun-running operation spanning several states. Mack had connections in Detroit, Chicago, and even as far as Atlanta, where illegal firearms were in high demand. The stolen weapons had been earmarked for buyers long before the heist even took place, with encrypted messages and burner phones being used to set up deals. As the investigation deepened, authorities focused on tracking down the missing weapons. ATF agents raided multiple locations in Detroit, leading to several smaller arrests, but the biggest breakthrough came in an unexpected place. 2 months after the heist, a Glock 19 pistol linked to the robbery surfaced at a crime scene in Cincinnati. A routine traffic stop had led officers to a car filled with gang members, one of whom was carrying the stolen weapon. With pressure mounting, authorities flipped one of the arrested gang members, who revealed that Mack's stolen firearms had already begun circulating in the black market. Many had been sold off within days of the heist, moving through an underground pipeline that law enforcement had struggled for years to dismantle. The stolen firearms were transported using hidden compartments in vehicles, often disguised as shipments of legal goods, making them difficult to detect. As authorities worked to trace each weapon, Mack himself was facing the full weight of the legal system. Prosecutors sought to make an example out of him, arguing that his operation had put countless lives at risk. They presented a mountain of evidence in court: phone records, financial transactions, and surveillance footage, all painting Mack as the mastermind behind a dangerous weapons trafficking scheme. Despite his lawyers' attempts to argue that Mack had been forced into a life of crime due to his upbringing, the jury was unmoved. Mack was convicted on multiple charges, including armed robbery, illegal firearms distribution, and conspiracy. His sentence was severe, 45 years without the possibility of parole. Deshaun Carter, who had a history of violent offenses, received 30 years. Luis Ortega, as the getaway driver, was given 20 years, while Aaron Mills did not survive his injuries from the police shootout. Even with Mack behind bars, the case was far from over. The stolen weapons continued to resurface in violent crimes across the country, a grim reminder of the heist's long-term consequences. Authorities knew that as long as demand for illegal firearms existed, criminals like Mack would continue to take risks for the promise of wealth and power. Mack himself never expressed remorse for his crimes. In prison, he became something of a legend among other inmates, a man who had tried to pull off one of the boldest firearm heists in recent history. But outside the walls of his cell, his legacy was one of bloodshed, regret, and a stark reminder of how one night of crime could have consequences that lasted for decades. Inside the high-security federal penitentiary, where Mack was serving his 45-year sentence, he quickly adapted to life behind bars. Prison politics were just as dangerous as the streets, and with his reputation as a mastermind criminal, he was both feared and respected among the inmates. Some saw him as a legend, a man who had almost pulled off the perfect heist. Others saw him as reckless, a fool who got caught while his stolen guns still fueled violence across the country. But Mack himself didn't care about his legacy among criminals. He had accepted that he would never see the outside world again. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, law enforcement continued their pursuit of the missing firearms. The ATF task force dedicated to the case worked relentlessly, tracking weapons that had surfaced in violent crimes. Some had been used in gang shootings in Chicago, others in armed robberies in Texas. Every recovered weapon was another piece of the puzzle, and each one provided a clearer picture of how Mac's gun pipeline had operated. Investigators found that after the heist, Mac's crew had moved fast to distribute the weapons, using a mix of local criminals and professional smugglers. Many of the guns had been transported through hidden compartments in freight trucks, making it difficult for authorities to track their movement. Some were shipped across state lines inside legal shipments of household goods, while others were smuggled into Mexico, where American firearms were highly sought after by cartels. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when federal agents raided a warehouse in St. Louis linked to Mac's network. Inside, they found not only some of the stolen firearms, but also evidence that the operation had been larger than they had originally thought. Documents recovered at the scene suggested that Mac's crew had been planning to expand into a full-scale arms trafficking business, supplying illegal firearms to multiple criminal organizations. This revelation only reinforced the devastating impact of the heist. Even with Mac in prison, his influence still lingered. But while law enforcement focused on dismantling the remnants of Mac's operation, a new threat was emerging. With the original crew either dead, imprisoned, or on the run, other criminal groups saw an opportunity to take over Mac's business. The demand for illegal firearms hadn't disappeared, and now that Mac was out of the picture, a violent power struggle began to take shape in the underground market. One of the key players in this new wave of gun trafficking was a man named Carlos Viper Morales, a former associate of Mac's who had managed to avoid arrest during the initial investigation. Viper had learned from Mac's mistakes and was determined not to get caught. Unlike Mac, who had relied on brute force and risky heists, Viper operated with a much lower profile. He built his network using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous financial transactions, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track him down. As the years passed, the ripple effects of Mac's heist continued to be felt. Some of the stolen weapons remained in circulation, used in crimes across the country. Families of victims, law enforcement officials, and even politicians pointed to the case as a prime example of the dangers of illegal gun trafficking. Debates over firearm regulations reignited, with some calling for stricter background checks and harsher penalties for gun smugglers. But for Mac, none of that mattered anymore. Sitting in his prison cell, he had come to accept his fate. He had once dreamed of being the king of the streets, of making enough money to escape the life of struggle he had been born into. But in the end, all he had gained was a lifetime behind bars. The world outside moved on without him, and the criminal empire he had tried to build had crumbled into dust. Yet, in the darkest corners of the underground, his legacy lived on. Young criminals still whispered his name, telling stories of the man who had once stolen an arsenal of weapons in the dead of night. And as long as there were those willing to risk it all for power and money, another Mac Holloway would rise again, repeating the same cycle of crime, ambition, and inevitable downfall. Case 4. Surya Lek. Vinam was not a man born into crime, but circumstances had shaped him into one. Raised in the outskirts of Bangkok, he spent most of his childhood in poverty, watching his father struggle as a low-ranking security guard and his mother sell food on the streets just to make ends meet. As he grew older, he became drawn to the allure of easy money, quickly falling into the company of gangsters and smugglers who operated along the porous borders of Thailand. By his early 20s, he had established a reputation as a ruthless enforcer for an underground arms syndicate that funneled stolen and black market weapons across Southeast Asia. By 2017, Surya had become the mastermind of his own operations. His criminal enterprise specialized in robbing weapons shipments and reselling them to militant groups and crime syndicates in neighboring countries. His network of informants, corrupt officials, and skilled gunmen made him nearly untouchable. But with the Thai government cracking down on illegal arms trafficking, his operations became riskier, forcing him to take more drastic measures to maintain his dominance. In September of that year, he set his sights on a high-profile target, a military transport carrying a cache of newly imported firearms, including assault rifles, handguns, and tactical gear, all meant for an elite police division in Chiang Mai. The convoy was heavily guarded, but Surya had an inside man, one of the transport drivers, who had been on his payroll for months. With carefully planned precision, He and his crew orchestrated an ambush along a remote stretch of highway in the northern provinces, where dense forests provided the perfect cover. On the night of the heist, the convoy slowed as it approached what appeared to be a routine checkpoint, manned by men in police uniforms. Unbeknownst to the real officers in the convoy, the supposed checkpoint was a carefully staged ruse. The moment the lead vehicle stopped, gunfire erupted. Within minutes, the armed gang overwhelmed the security detail, killing 2 officers in the process. The surviving guards were restrained, and Suria's men swiftly loaded the stolen firearms into their trucks before disappearing into the night. However, the robbery alone wasn't enough. To ensure they had leverage in case authorities pursued them too aggressively, they took one of the officers hostage, a high-ranking official named Captain Anand Suwan. Anand, known for his relentless pursuit of arms traffickers, was a valuable bargaining chip. Surya knew that his capture would send shockwaves through law enforcement and force the authorities into a difficult position. The Thai police launched one of the largest manhunts in recent history, scouring the jungles and border towns for any trace of the gang. Intelligence units intercepted encrypted messages suggesting that Surya was planning to transport the weapons and his hostage across the Mekong River into Laos, where they would be sold to buyers with deep pockets. Time was running out. A week later, acting on a critical tip-off, elite police units and military forces raided a secluded hideout in the mountains near the Laos border. A violent firefight broke out as Surya's men fought desperately to escape. One by one, his gunmen were either captured or killed. Seeing no way out, Surya attempted to flee into the jungle, using Captain Anand as a human shield. But the authorities were prepared. A sniper took a calculated shot, hitting Surya in the leg, forcing him to surrender. The hostage was rescued unharmed, and the stolen weapons were recovered before they could be smuggled out of the country. Surya was taken into custody, charged with armed robbery, murder, and kidnapping. During his trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including testimony from captured gang members and forensic evidence linking him to multiple crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case sent a clear message to the underworld. No matter how powerful a criminal may seem, justice would find its way. But the incident also exposed deep-rooted corruption and the alarming reality of arms trafficking networks operating in Southeast Asia. Despite Surya's downfall, law enforcement knew that his empire had not completely crumbled. Others would rise to take his place, and the battle against illegal arms trade was far from over. Inside the high-security prison where Surya-elect Danam was being held, the air was thick with tension. His capture had not only disrupted the flow of illegal weapons in Thailand, but had also sent shockwaves through the powerful networks of smugglers and corrupt officials who had long profited from his operations. While the public celebrated his arrest, those who had once worked with him were scrambling to cover their tracks, fearing that Surya might exchange secrets for a reduced sentence. The authorities had placed him in solitary confinement, aware that there were many who wanted him silenced before he could speak. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the Thai police continued their pursuit of the remnants of Surya's organization. Although his capture was a major victory, the case was far from closed. His second-in-command, a man known only as T, had managed to escape during the raid at the border and had gone underground. Intelligence reports suggested that T was gathering what was left of their network, planning either a counterattack or an escape operation to free Surya before he could be transferred to a more secure location. For the authorities, this was a race against time. They had dismantled Surya's immediate circle, but the weapons trade was far from over. In the weeks following the raid, forensic analysis of the recovered arms revealed serial numbers matching weapons stolen from military stockpiles as far away as Cambodia and Malaysia. This confirmed their worst fears. Surya's syndicate was only part of a much larger operation, one that involved cross-border smuggling and high-level corruption. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement uncovered a chilling detail. The convoy ambush had not been a simple robbery, but part of a broader plan to destabilize security forces in the region. Evidence suggested that some of the stolen weapons were intended for extremist groups in neighboring countries, while others had been set aside for domestic buyers, including criminal factions operating in Bangkok's underworld. This revelation transformed the case from a high-profile heist into a matter of national security. The urgency of the situation intensified when Captain Anand Suwan, the officer who had been taken hostage and later rescued, came forward with unsettling details about his captivity. He described being held in a remote hideout deep within the jungle, where he had overheard conversations between Surya and his men. They had spoken in code, but one thing had been clear: Surya had not been working alone. There were others, possibly within the government or military, who had facilitated his operations and provided him with inside information. Determined to expose the full extent of the conspiracy, Thai intelligence agencies launched a covert operation to track T's movements. Surveillance footage and intercepted communications placed him near the Burmese border, where he was believed to be negotiating safe passage with local warlords in exchange for weapons. The authorities knew that if T succeeded in regrouping, the violence and instability would continue. In a daring midnight raid, a joint task force composed of Thai special forces and border police stormed a compound suspected to be T's hideout. The battle was swift but brutal. T and his men fought fiercely, knowing they had no way out. By the time the gunfire ceased, several gang members lay dead, while T himself had vanished into the dense jungle. The failure to capture him was a blow to the investigation, but it also fueled the determination of law enforcement. With the case now involving international crime syndicates, Thai officials sought cooperation from neighboring governments. Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar tightened security along their borders, making it harder for T to move freely. His options were running out. Back in prison, Surya remained eerily silent. Despite interrogations and the looming threat of life imprisonment, he refused to reveal anything about his larger network. Investigators suspected that he still held some leverage, perhaps a hidden stash of weapons, or contacts within the government who were working to secure his release. One thing was certain: the war against illegal arms trafficking in Thailand was far from over. Surya's downfall had left a power vacuum, and as long as there was demand, there would always be someone willing to supply. The authorities had won a battle, but the fight against the underworld had only just begun. As the hunt for T continued, law enforcement agencies across Thailand and its neighboring countries remained on high alert. Intelligence sources suggested that he had crossed into Myanmar, seeking refuge among one of the armed insurgent groups operating in the region. If true, this would complicate matters significantly, as crossing into Myanmar's lawless borderlands meant T could potentially secure protection in exchange for weapons, cash, or even information. The Thai authorities knew that if he managed to forge such an alliance, he could rebuild his operation within months. Meanwhile, inside the high-security Bangkok remand prison, Surya Lek Thanam maintained an unsettling silence. The former arms smuggler, now one of the most heavily guarded prisoners in Thailand, rarely spoke during interrogations. Despite repeated attempts to extract information, he remained composed, his expression betraying nothing. Investigators knew he was withholding critical information, likely details about his broader network, corrupt officials involved, and hidden weapon stockpiles. But without concrete evidence or a confession, they could only speculate. What troubled authorities the most was the possibility that Surya had planned for this moment all along. His arrest had been a significant victory, but it had not dismantled the entire network. The remnants of his operation were still active, and there were signs that someone, perhaps one of his silent backers, was working behind the scenes to secure his release. The suspicion grew stronger when prison officials intercepted coded messages attempting to reach Surya from an unknown source. The messages were vague but hinted at an upcoming operation. Fearing a potential escape attempt, authorities moved him to an even more secure wing of the prison, increasing surveillance and limiting his communication with the outside world. At the same time, the forensic analysis of the seized weapons from the border ambush continued to yield disturbing discoveries. Several rifles bore markings indicating that they had been smuggled out of military stockpiles, but what was more concerning was the presence of advanced weaponry, anti-material rifles, and explosives that were not typically available through standard black market channels. This suggested that Surya's syndicate had access to military-grade arms, possibly through inside connections. Determined to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy, Thai intelligence officers launched a joint operation with Interpol and the intelligence agencies of Cambodia, Malaysia, and Laos. Their investigation led them to a series of offshore accounts linked to shell companies based in Hong Kong and Singapore, indicating that the arms trade was being financed through a complex web of international money laundering. As law enforcement traced the funds, they found links to individuals in Thailand's corporate and political sectors, people who had never been publicly associated with criminal activity, but had quietly profited from the illegal arms trade. The revelation sent shockwaves through Thailand's elite circles, as it became evident that this was more than just an underground smuggling ring. It was a deeply entrenched system of corruption that had allowed criminals like Surya to operate with near impunity for years. While the investigation into these financial dealings continued, special forces remained focused on capturing T before he could re-establish his network. Surveillance drones and intelligence operatives tracked movements in the remote border regions, monitoring known hideouts used by insurgent groups. Then, after weeks of searching, a breakthrough came. A tip from an informant revealed that T had been spotted near the Thai-Myanmar border, attempting to negotiate a deal for a safe passage out of Southeast Asia. He was reportedly planning to move to the Middle East, where he had potential buyers waiting for a fresh supply of military-grade weapons. Realizing that this could be their last chance to capture him, Thai authorities launched a high-risk operation. A specialized unit of the Royal Thai Police, alongside border security forces, mobilized to intercept him. They moved in under the cover of darkness, surrounding the makeshift hideout where T and his remaining men were holed up. The operation did not go smoothly. T's men, though fewer in number than before, were heavily armed and willing to fight to the end. A violent gunfight erupted, with the sounds of automatic fire echoing through the jungle. The battle lasted nearly an hour before the security forces gained the upper hand. By the time the dust settled, T was among the dead. His body was found with a bullet wound to the chest, his weapon still in his grip. The remaining members of his gang were either captured or killed, effectively dismantling the last active remnants of Surya's operation. With T gone, the focus shifted back to Surya, who remained locked away but undoubtedly aware of the events unfolding outside. Investigators knew that his influence had not disappeared completely, and the possibility of another figure rising to take his place was a constant threat. The crackdown on arms trafficking continued, with authorities making several high-profile arrests in the months that followed. Corrupt officials, businessmen, and former military personnel were exposed, their involvement in the illegal trade brought to light. However, despite these efforts, there was an unshakable reality. The black market for weapons was not something that could be eradicated entirely. Surya's downfall had been a major victory, but in the underworld of international arms smuggling, there was always someone waiting to take the throne. And as long as there was conflict and demand, the cycle would inevitably continue. Case 5. In the mid-1990s, Cambodia was a nation emerging from decades of conflict, with remnants of the Khmer Rouge still active in certain regions. One such area was Phnom Vor, a mountainous region in the southern part of the country. This area became infamous in 1994 due to a tragic event that underscored the lingering instability and dangers present during that time. On July 26, 1994, a passenger train traveling from Phnom Penh to Sihanoukville was ambushed by a group of Khmer Rouge guerrillas near Phnom Vor. The attackers, led by Commander Sam Biff, derailed the train and opened fire, resulting in the deaths of at least 13 Cambodian passengers. In the chaos, the guerrillas abducted more than 100 hostages, including 3 Western backpackers, Australian David Wilson, Briton Mark Slater, and Frenchman Jean-Michel Braquet. Sam Biff, born on May 1, 1933, was a high-ranking official within the Khmer Rouge hierarchy. Having served as a deputy to the notorious military leader Tam Ok, Biff was known for his strategic acumen and ruthless tactics. By the early 1990s, as the Khmer Rouge's power waned, commanders like Biff resorted to kidnappings and banditry to sustain their diminishing forces. Following the train ambush, the hostages were marched into the dense jungles of Phnom Vor. The Khmer Rouge demanded a ransom and political concessions from the Cambodian government in exchange for the release of the captives. Despite prolonged negotiations, the demands were not met, and tragically, after several months in captivity, the 3 Western hostages were executed. Their deaths drew international condemnation and highlighted the persistent threat posed by the remaining Khmer Rouge factions. In the years that followed, efforts to bring those responsible to justice intensified. Sam Biff evaded capture for several years, but in 2002, he was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including kidnapping and murder. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. Biff died on February 15, 2008, while serving his sentence. This incident remains one of the most notorious kidnappings in Cambodia's recent history, symbolizing the challenges the nation faced during its transition from a war-torn past to a more stable present. As news of the kidnappings spread, diplomatic channels were immediately activated. The governments of Australia, the United Kingdom, and France applied pressure on Cambodian authorities to secure the safe release of their citizens. However, dealing with the remnants of the Khmer Rouge was a delicate matter. The group still controlled pockets of territory, particularly in remote jungle regions, and had a history of brutal tactics, making negotiations perilous. The hostages, David Wilson, Mark Slater, and Jean-Michel Braquet, were taken deep into the forests of Phnom Penh, where they were kept in makeshift bamboo cages. They were guarded around the clock by heavily armed Khmer Rouge soldiers, who were distrustful of outsiders and adhered to a strict ideology of secrecy and paranoia. Food was scarce, and conditions in the jungle were harsh, with scorching daytime temperatures and frigid nights. The Khmer Rouge commander overseeing the operation, Chuk Rin, was known for his unwavering loyalty to the movement. He had been indoctrinated during the Cambodian Civil War and had risen through the ranks due to his ability to execute orders without hesitation. Under his command, the prisoners were subjected to mental and physical strain, often forced to march long distances under the threat of execution. For weeks, the Khmer Rouge played a dangerous game, using the hostages as bargaining chips. They demanded the release of captured Khmer Rouge members from Cambodian prisons, safe passage to a more secure stronghold, and a hefty ransom payment. The Cambodian government, under Prime Minister Norodom Ranariddh and Second Prime Minister Hun Sen, faced a difficult decision. Conceding to the guerrillas' demands could set a dangerous precedent, encouraging more kidnappings, yet failing to act decisively could result in the deaths of the hostages. Months passed with no resolution in sight. Inside their jungle prison, the three hostages remained hopeful, unaware that time was running out. Their captors grew increasingly frustrated as negotiations stalled and the Khmer Rouge began to sense that their leverage was slipping away. Desperation set in among the commanders, and the tone of their messages to government officials became more aggressive. In early September, reports surfaced that the Khmer Rouge had issued an ultimatum. If their demands were not met within a matter of days, the hostages would be executed. The announcement sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community, triggering frantic last-minute attempts to negotiate a settlement. Despite these efforts, communication with the captors became increasingly sporadic. Then, without warning, all contact ceased. On September 28, 1994, a grim discovery confirmed the worst fears. The bodies of David Wilson, Mark Slater, and Jean-Michel Braquet were found in shallow graves near the jungle camp. All three had been executed, likely days earlier, in what appeared to be a final act of defiance by their captors. The news devastated their families and sparked international outrage. In the aftermath, Cambodian authorities launched a manhunt to track down those responsible. Chuk Rin managed to evade capture for several years, but eventually surrendered in 2000. He was tried and sentenced to life in prison, though he was controversially released on humanitarian grounds in 2015 due to illness. Sam Biff, the senior Khmer Rouge commander implicated in the crime, was arrested in 2002 and also received a life sentence. The Phnom Penh kidnappings remain one of the darkest chapters in Cambodia's post-war history. The incident highlighted the fragility of peace in a country still grappling with the remnants of a violent past, and it served as a stark reminder of the risks faced by those who ventured into unstable regions. Decades later, the families of the victims continue to seek full accountability, ensuring that the tragedy is never forgotten. The fallout from the Phnom Penh kidnappings was immediate and far-reaching. Internationally, the murders of David Wilson, Mark Slater, and Jean-Michel Braquet sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Western governments condemned the killings in the strongest possible terms, calling for justice and a renewed crackdown on the Khmer Rouge insurgency. In Cambodia, the event intensified ongoing discussions about the country's fragile post-war stability and the lingering influence of the once dominant guerrilla faction. For the families of the victims, the loss was devastating. They had clung to hope for months, believing that negotiations might bring their loved ones home safely. When the news of their executions broke, grief quickly turned into calls for accountability. The Australian, British, and French governments demanded answers from Cambodian authorities, pressing them to bring the perpetrators to justice. Pressure mounted on the coalition government, led by Prince Norodom Ranariddh and Hun Sen, to act decisively. In response, the Cambodian military intensified operations against the Khmer Rouge stronghold in the Phnom Penh region. A series of raids targeted known hideouts, but the dense jungle and difficult terrain made progress slow. The guerrillas, trained in jungle warfare and deeply familiar with the landscape, evaded capture time and time again. For years, Chuk Rin, the commander directly responsible for the hostages, remained elusive. His knowledge of the terrain and his ability to blend into sympathetic communities made him nearly impossible to track. Eventually, as Cambodia transitioned further into a period of peace and reconstruction, the Khmer Rouge's power waned. Many of its former fighters surrendered under government amnesty programs, and leaders who had once commanded terror found themselves hunted fugitives. In 2000, after years of hiding, Chuk Rin turned himself in, hoping for leniency. He was put on trial and sentenced to life in prison. His defense, that he had merely been following orders and had tried to save the hostages, was dismissed by the courts. In 2015, he was controversially released on humanitarian grounds due to his failing health, a decision that angered the victims' families. Sam Bith, another senior Khmer Rouge commander, was arrested in 2002 and similarly sentenced to life imprisonment. Unlike Chuk Rin, he remained incarcerated until his death in 2008. His capture and sentencing marked one of the few instances where former Khmer Rouge leaders were held directly accountable for their crimes. But for many, it was too little too late. The legacy of the Phnom Vore kidnappings is still felt in Cambodia today. The incident highlighted the dangers posed by insurgent remnants long after conflicts officially end. It also exposed the weaknesses of a fragile government struggling to assert control over a country still recovering from decades of war and genocide. For foreign travelers, it served as a grim reminder of the risks associated with venturing into unstable regions, and for Cambodia's leadership, it underscored the need for a stronger, more unified response to lingering security threats. Though decades have passed since the tragic events of 1994, the families of David Wilson, Mark Slater, and Jean-Michel Braquet continue to seek full accountability. Their loss remains a painful reminder of a dark chapter in Cambodia's history, one that they refuse to let fade into obscurity. Case 6. In the early morning hours of August 23, 2018, a gruesome murder in the quiet suburbs of Brisbane, Australia, sent shockwaves through the community. The man responsible was 31-year-old Thomas Caldwell, a former security contractor with a history of aggressive behavior and financial distress. A once promising career had spiraled downward due to a series of poor decisions, including a gambling addiction that left him drowning in debt. Friends and family had grown distant, weary of his unpredictable temper and erratic lifestyle. For months leading up to the murder, Caldwell had been fixated on one person, his former business partner, Mark Reynolds, a 45-year-old real estate developer who had cut ties with him after a failed investment deal. Caldwell believed Reynolds had cheated him out of a significant sum of money, and resentment festered into something far more sinister. He began tracking Reynolds' daily routine, lurking outside his office and even breaking into his emails, desperate for any leverage he could find. But in his paranoid mind, revenge became the only solution. On the night of August 22nd, Caldwell drove to Reynolds' home, a spacious property on the outskirts of the city. Armed with a hunting knife and wearing dark clothing, he broke in through the back entrance, moving swiftly through the house. Reynolds had just returned from an evening business meeting and was in the kitchen when Caldwell confronted him. A struggle ensued, and before Reynolds could call for help, Caldwell stabbed him multiple times in the chest and neck. The attack was brutal, fueled by years of pent-up anger and desperation. After ensuring Reynolds was dead, Caldwell attempted to stage the scene as a robbery gone wrong. He ransacked the house, knocking over furniture and scattering valuables, then fled the scene in his car. But in his haste, he left behind crucial evidence: a blood-stained glove near the doorway and surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera, which captured his vehicle leaving the premises at the time of the murder. The next morning, Reynolds' assistant arrived at the house for a scheduled meeting and discovered the horrific scene. Authorities were immediately called, and within hours, a manhunt was underway. The police pieced together Caldwell's motives quickly, given his public grievances against Reynolds and prior threats made in anger. By the evening of August 24th, law enforcement tracked him down to a motel just outside the city, where he had been hiding. His arrest was swift and under interrogation. He initially denied involvement but later confessed when confronted with the overwhelming evidence. During his trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and desperation, incapable of rational thought. The defense argued for diminished responsibility, citing Caldwell's mental health struggles but the jury was unmoved. In October 2019, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The case left an indelible mark on Brisbane's legal community, serving as a stark reminder of how financial ruin, unchecked anger, and obsession could drive a man to commit an unthinkable act. For Reynolds' family, justice had been served, but the loss was irreparable. His wife and 2 children, forever haunted by that tragic night, moved away from Brisbane, seeking to leave behind the echoes of a crime that shattered their lives. In the weeks following Thomas Caldwell's conviction, the media continued to dissect the case, attempting to unravel what led an otherwise ordinary man to commit such a horrific act. Journalists dug into his past, uncovering a history of financial instability, reckless behavior, and failed business ventures. Some speculated that his downfall had begun years earlier, when he first became involved in high-risk investments, losing tens of thousands of dollars in bad deals. Others pointed to his growing isolation. His friends had distanced themselves, and his family had stopped responding to his erratic calls and messages. The mounting pressure had left Caldwell desperate, pushing him to an irreversible breaking point. As investigators examined Caldwell's movements leading up to the murder, they discovered a disturbing level of premeditation. His internet search history revealed weeks of research into violent crimes, forensic evidence, and ways to avoid detection. He had driven past Reynolds' home multiple times in the days before the attack, carefully noting the layout of the house and the patterns of its occupants. When police reviewed his bank records, they found that in the days before the murder, he had withdrawn several $1,000s, likely planning to flee after the crime. However, his poor planning and impulsivity ultimately led to his capture, just hours after Reynolds' body was found. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was how Caldwell had acted after the murder. After fleeing the crime scene, he had checked into a low-budget motel, less than 20 miles from the site of the killing. There, he spent the night drinking heavily and watching news reports about the murder, waiting to see how authorities would respond. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed him buying beer and cigarettes, his expression disturbingly calm given what he had just done. Investigators later found that he had made several calls to unknown numbers, possibly trying to secure a way out of the country, though those leads ultimately led nowhere. When police finally caught up with Caldwell the following evening, he was in a haze of exhaustion and alcohol. The arrest was swift. Officers kicked down the motel door after he refused to respond to commands, finding him sitting on the bed, his face blank with resignation. During interrogation, he initially denied any involvement, claiming he had spent the night alone, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. When confronted with the blood-stained glove left at the crime scene and the damning security footage, his facade crumbled. He broke down, sobbing as he confessed to the crime, claiming he had never intended for things to escalate the way they did. Caldwell's trial, which began in the summer of 2019, was closely watched. The prosecution laid out a clear timeline of events, demonstrating the calculated nature of his actions. The defense attempted to argue that he had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage rather than premeditated murder, hoping to reduce the severity of his sentence. They brought in psychologists who testified about his declining mental state, his increasing paranoia, and his history of anxiety and depression. While the court acknowledged his mental struggles, the jury was unconvinced that they were enough to excuse his actions. Throughout the trial, Reynolds' family sat in the courtroom, listening to the harrowing details of the night he was murdered. His wife, Julia Reynolds, later spoke to the press, describing the immense toll the case had taken on her and her children. "We lost more than a husband and a father that night," she said. "We lost our sense of security, our faith in people we once trusted. No amount of justice will ever bring Mark back, but we needed this conviction to move forward." When the verdict was delivered, guilty of first-degree murder, Caldwell showed little reaction. His once defiant demeanor had faded, replaced by an empty stare. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before the possibility of parole. He was immediately transferred to a maximum security facility, where he would spend the rest of his days surrounded by others who had made similar irreversible choices. Even after the trial concluded, the case left an enduring impact on the community. It became a cautionary tale of how financial ruin, unchecked resentment, and isolation could lead to devastating consequences. Discussions arose about the importance of mental health resources, the warning signs of violent behavior, and the responsibilities people had to report concerning actions before they escalated into tragedy. For Reynolds' family, the sentencing brought a semblance of closure, but the void left by his murder would never truly heal. Julia eventually relocated with their children, leaving behind the home that had become a place of unbearable memories. She later established a foundation in Mark's name, dedicated to supporting families affected by violent crime. Meanwhile, Caldwell faded into obscurity, his name becoming just another entry in Australia's long history of high-profile murder cases. As Thomas Caldwell adjusted to life behind bars, the weight of his choices became increasingly difficult to ignore. His arrogance, once evident in the early days of his incarceration, faded as the reality of his life sentence set in. Prison was not the escape he had once envisioned when he plotted Mark Reynolds' murder. It was a slow, suffocating existence filled with monotony and regret. Caldwell was transferred to a maximum security prison in the outskirts of New South Wales, where he was placed among some of Australia's most dangerous criminals. The facility housed murderers, drug lords, and career criminals, men who had long since resigned themselves to a life behind bars. For someone like Caldwell, whose crime, though brutal, was fueled more by desperation than a history of violence, the adjustment was brutal. His soft-spoken nature made him an easy target for intimidation. He quickly learned that in a place like this, any sign of weakness could turn fatal. The guards kept a watchful eye on him in his first few months, knowing that inmates convicted of high-profile murders often faced a particularly harsh time in prison. Some saw him as a coward, a man who had killed out of greed and selfishness rather than any street code or criminal allegiance. Others simply viewed him as another inmate, no different from the rest. Caldwell tried to keep his head down, but rumors of his case followed him. Inmates whispered about the murder, about the money he never got to spend, about the sheer recklessness of his actions. Despite the bleak environment, Caldwell still had visitors in the early months of his incarceration. His sister, Emily Caldwell, came to see him once, though it was clear she struggled to recognize the man sitting across from her. She had been the last member of the family to hold on to hope, the last to believe that maybe, just maybe, her brother had been framed or had acted out of genuine self-defense. But the evidence had been undeniable, and as she looked at him, his face now gaunt, his posture slumped with defeat, she knew this was the last time she would visit. She left without a word, and Caldwell never heard from her again. The months turned into years. Caldwell's name disappeared from the headlines, replaced by newer, more sensational crimes. The world moved on, but he remained stuck in the same cycle. Waking up at dawn, eating the same meals, walking the same concrete yard, staring at the same walls. The regret that had once consumed him dulled over time, replaced by an eerie emptiness. At some point, he stopped counting the days. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the world did not forget Mark Reynolds. His wife, Julia, continued to advocate for victims of violent crime, turning her grief into action. The foundation she had established in Mark's name grew, offering support to families who had suffered similar losses. She spoke at events, partnered with law enforcement, and even worked with legislators to push for stricter sentencing for premeditated crimes. Though she never publicly mentioned Caldwell's name again, his actions had ignited a movement that would far outlast his time in the public eye. As Caldwell approached his 10th year in prison, he received word that an appeal he had quietly filed years earlier had been rejected. The news didn't come as a surprise. The evidence against him had been too strong, the trial too conclusive. There was no legal loophole that could save him. His fate had been sealed the moment he took Mark Reynolds' life. Some prisoners hold on to hope, believing that one day they might walk free. Caldwell wasn't one of them. He knew that even if he were granted parole in another 15 years, there would be nothing left for him outside. No family, no fortune, no second chance. His life had ended the moment he let greed dictate his actions. And so, he lived on in the prison system, another forgotten name in a place filled with lost souls. The man who had once dreamed of wealth and power now had nothing, no freedom, no future, no redemption. Just time. Endless, unforgiving time. Case 7. In the early 2000s, Melbourne was a city gripped by fear. A shadow loomed over its bustling streets, an underworld war unfolding in the corners of quiet neighborhoods, in the parking lots of suburban homes, and even in broad daylight at public spaces. This was the era of the Melbourne gangland killings, a time when criminals no longer settled disputes with whispered threats or backroom deals, but with bullets and blood. At the center of this storm stood one man, Carl Anthony Williams. Carl Williams wasn't born into crime, nor was he raised in a world of hardened gangsters. He grew up in a modest working-class family in Melbourne, the son of George and Barbara Williams. For much of his early life, he remained in the shadows of the city's more notorious underworld figures, working menial jobs and running small-time scams. But ambition burned within him, and the lure of fast money proved too great. By the late 1990s, he had found his way into the lucrative drug trade, a world ruled by old-school criminals who had spent decades building their empires. At first, Williams played the role of a silent partner, watching and learning from the powerful Moran family, who controlled a significant portion of Melbourne's drug market. He supplied and distributed amphetamines, making connections in the criminal underworld and gradually expanding his influence. But Williams was never satisfied with being second to anyone. He saw weaknesses in the system, cracks in the armor of those who had been in power for too long. He wanted more. His rise to infamy began on October 13, 1999. That day, what should have been a simple meeting to discuss debts and territory between Williams and Jason Moran turned violent. A gun was drawn, and Williams was shot in the stomach. He barely survived, but the incident left something far more dangerous than a scar. It left a thirst for revenge. The attack had turned him from a businessman into a warrior, one who would stop at nothing to seize control. In the following years, bodies began to drop. Mark Moran was the first major casualty, gunned down outside his home in June 2000. His death sent a clear message. Carl Williams was no longer just another player in the game. He was coming for the throne. But the Morans did not go down without a fight. Retaliation loomed, and the war escalated. By 2003, Melbourne was no longer safe. Gunfire erupted in unexpected places. Jason Moran and Pasquale Barbaro were killed while sitting in a parked van outside a children's football practice. The kind of attack that shattered the illusion that civilians were off limits. It was a war without rules, and Carl Williams was winning. His empire grew, absorbing the power left behind by the bodies of his enemies. But violence has a way of catching up, no matter how powerful one becomes. By 2004, Williams' name was whispered in police investigations and crime reports. Informants turned against him, and the law finally closed in. He was arrested, charged with multiple murders, and in 2007 he pleaded guilty. The courtroom was packed, not just with law enforcement officers eager to see him locked away, but with journalists, families of his victims, and even former allies who had survived his rise to power. He was sentenced to life in prison, his once great empire reduced to whispers and fading memories. But even behind bars, Williams' past could not be escaped. On April 19, 2010, while serving his sentence at Barwon Prison, he was attacked by a fellow inmate. The man struck him repeatedly with a metal rod, delivering a fatal blow that ended the reign of one of Australia's most notorious crime lords. Carl Williams was gone, but his story lived on, immortalized in books, documentaries, and the television series Underbelly. His legacy was not one of triumph, but of destruction, a tale of ambition that burned too bright, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. And Melbourne, once gripped by fear, took a breath of relief. The war was over, but the scars remained. The death of Carl Williams in 2010 marked the end of an era, but his shadow still loomed over Melbourne. Even behind bars, he had remained a powerful figure, his name whispered in the corridors of power and crime alike. His murder inside Barwon Prison was a chilling reminder that in the world of organized crime, debts were never forgotten, and revenge had no expiration date. Williams' rise to power had not been an accident. It had been calculated, methodical, and ruthless. He had taken advantage of the fractures within Melbourne's underworld, eliminating rivals one by one until he stood at the top. But in doing so, he had created a long list of enemies, men who had lost brothers, fathers, and friends to his war. Even locked away, he was still a marked man. His execution was brutal and unrelenting. The killer, Matthew Johnson, was a hardened criminal with his own reputation for violence. Prison surveillance footage would later show Johnson approaching Williams from behind in the common area, carrying a heavy metal rod from an exercise bike. Without hesitation, he struck Williams in the head, again and again, until his victim collapsed. There was no struggle, no final words, only the cold efficiency of a man carrying out an act that had been long in the making. When the guards finally arrived, it was already too late. Many speculated on the reasons behind his murder. Some believed it was a hit ordered by old enemies, a delayed act of vengeance for the bloodshed he had caused in Melbourne's gangland wars. Others suggested it was about control. Inside prison, Williams had been cooperating with police, providing information that could bring down others still walking free. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain. The underworld had not forgotten Carl Williams, and they had made sure he did not escape justice, even in a cell. The aftermath of his death sent ripples through both the criminal underworld and the legal system. Investigations into corruption revealed that Williams had been receiving special privileges inside prison, fueling speculation that he had struck deals with authorities. A controversial arrangement had allowed him access to better food, private meetings, and even secret discussions with law enforcement. But all of that had only made him more vulnerable. In a world where loyalty was a currency, Williams had been seen as a traitor, and traitors did not get second chances. Outside the prison walls, the remnants of his empire crumbled. His associates, once untouchable figures in Melbourne's underworld, now faced arrests, betrayals, and internal conflicts. Some attempted to take what little power remained, while others fled, seeking refuge in anonymity. The police, emboldened by the fall of their greatest adversary, intensified their efforts to dismantle the network he had built. Williams' death did not erase the damage he had done. The families of his victims still carried their grief, and Melbourne, though safer than before, would never forget the years of fear and violence that had defined an entire generation. The Gangland War had left scars that could not be healed, a grim reminder that power gained through bloodshed would always end the same way. His name remained infamous, spoken in hushed tones among those who still lived in the shadows. Some saw him as a warning, a man who had flown too close to the sun and paid the ultimate price. Others, particularly the new breed of criminals rising in his wake, viewed him as a legend, proof that with enough ambition and ruthlessness, one could rise from nothing and take the city for themselves. But Melbourne had changed. The days of open executions and street wars had passed, replaced by a new era of crime, one where violence was more hidden, but no less deadly. As the years passed, the story of Carl Williams faded from the headlines, but it never truly disappeared. His name remained etched into the history of Australia's underworld, a cautionary tale of ambition, betrayal, and the inevitable cost of power. And in the dark corners of Melbourne, where new criminals plotted their rise, his ghost still lingered, a reminder that even kings of crime were never truly untouchable. Melbourne had seen its fair share of crime lords rise and fall, but Carl Williams' story was one that refused to fade. Even after his brutal murder in Barwon Prison, the ripple effects of his reign and downfall continued to shape Australia's criminal landscape. His death had been swift, decisive, and merciless, yet it had not brought closure. Instead, it had left a void, one that both law enforcement and the underworld scrambled to fill. In the months following Williams' killing, authorities intensified their crackdown on organized crime, determined to dismantle what remained of his empire. The Gangland Wars of the early 2000s had left Melbourne bloodied, and with Williams gone, some believed the violence would finally cease. But power does not disappear, it merely shifts hands. The question was, who would take his place? Old rivalries reignited in the wake of his absence. His former associates, once united under his leadership, found themselves without a clear path forward. Some sought to distance themselves from his legacy, eager to escape the inevitable scrutiny from police. Others saw an opportunity to claim a larger piece of the underworld, forging new alliances while settling old scores. But the power vacuum left behind was dangerous. The Melbourne underworld had been accustomed to a single dominant figure, and without one, the balance of power grew unstable. The man who had delivered the fatal blows, Matthew Johnson, had his own story to tell. A violent career criminal with deep ties to the prison underworld, Johnson had acted with brutal efficiency, but his motivations were never entirely clear. Officially, his attack on Williams was framed as an internal dispute, an act of prison violence rather than a premeditated assassination. But few believed it was that simple. Johnson was sentenced to life in prison for Williams' murder, but behind bars, he remained a feared figure. Some speculated he had been acting on behalf of others, perhaps carrying out a hit for those who had long wanted Williams dead. Others believed he had simply seized an opportunity, eliminating a man he saw as weak, a liability inside the prison walls. The truth, like much in the underworld, remained obscured. What was certain was that Johnson had delivered a message, one that resonated far beyond Barwon Prison. Williams' death was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. Even the most feared figures could be brought down with the right timing, the right circumstances, and the right weapon. In the wake of Williams' murder, deeper investigations into Victoria's correctional system revealed disturbing truths. It was no secret that corruption had played a role in William's criminal career. After all, he had operated with remarkable influence, even while incarcerated. But as more details emerged, the public was forced to confront just how compromised the system had become. Williams had been living in relative comfort inside Barwon prison. Reports surfaced of preferential treatment, secret meetings with law enforcement, and even leaked information that suggested he had been cooperating with authorities. It was this cooperation that many believed had sealed his fate. To his former allies, Williams had become a liability, a man who knew too much and was willing to talk. And in the underworld, there were few sins greater than betrayal. The scandal reached beyond the prison walls. Corrupt officials, bribed officers, and hidden deals came to light, exposing a network of influence that had allowed criminals to operate with near impunity. The revelations shook public confidence in the justice system, prompting sweeping reforms aimed at preventing such breaches in the future. But for many, it was too little too late. The damage had already been done. Despite his death, William's legend persisted. His story became the subject of books, documentaries, and even television dramas, cementing his place in Australia's criminal folklore. But for the families of his victims, there was nothing romantic about his legacy. The gangland wars had left behind a trail of shattered lives, grieving parents, orphaned children, and countless others whose only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For law enforcement, William's death was both a victory and a challenge. On one hand, it had removed a major player from Melbourne's criminal scene. On the other, it had created new problems, fresh conflicts, shifting alliances, and the emergence of younger, more ambitious criminals eager to take his place. The cycle of crime had not been broken, it had simply evolved. William's story served as a grim reminder of the nature of organized crime. There were no happy endings, no true winners, only temporary survivors. Those who rose to power did so with the knowledge that their reign would always be short-lived, their downfall inevitable. And as long as power remained a prize worth killing for, Melbourne's underworld would never truly be at peace. Years later, the streets of Melbourne still carried echoes of his name. The bars and clubs where deals had been made, the back alleys where lives had been lost, the prison where he had met his violent end. All of it was part of a story that refused to be forgotten. For some, he was a cautionary tale, a man who had climbed too high and paid the price. For others, he was a symbol of an era, one defined by ambition, greed, and bloodshed. But for those who had lived through the gangland wars, he was simply another name in a long line of men who had thought themselves untouchable, only to learn the truth too late. And in the darkest corners of the underworld, where whispers still carried weight, one truth remained. Power was never permanent, and death was always just one step away. Case 8. Sun Leong had always known that his life was a fragile balance of power, survival, and betrayal. He had lived in the shadows for too long, navigating the underworld of Southeast Asia with precision and caution. But now, after the massacre in the warehouse, that balance had been shattered. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire across Bangkok's criminal circles. Haroon Putra was dead, and Sun Leong was the prime suspect. The authorities had yet to take action, but that didn't mean he was safe. The people Haroon worked for, the real power behind his operations, would come looking for revenge. Sun didn't wait to see how things would unfold. He had always been a step ahead, and this time was no different. He slipped out of Bangkok before the sun had fully risen, leaving behind the car he had driven to the warehouse. He switched vehicles twice, paying cash to a corrupt mechanic in a back alley, and by the time the city began to wake, he was already on a train heading south toward Malaysia. He kept his head low, blending in with the other passengers, backpackers, traders, and locals going about their daily routines. His heart pounded every time the train stopped, every time he saw an officer patrolling the station. But no one was looking for him. Not yet. By the time he reached Penang, he had a new plan. He had connections in Indonesia, men who owed him favors, who could provide him with a new identity. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The moment Haroon's people realized he had left Thailand, they would spread their reach. Airports were out of the question. Borders were dangerous. He needed another way. For years, he had used the hidden networks of fishermen and smugglers that operated along the coast, men who knew the waters better than the authorities ever could. He found one of them in a small, nameless bar near the docks, a man called Iqbal, who had smuggled everything from stolen artifacts to fugitives escaping death sentences. But the price was steep. "I don't do charity," Iqbal had told him. Sun Leong had nothing left to bargain with, except information. He had spent his life gathering secrets, knowing that, in the right hands, information was worth more than gold. He gave Iqbal the name of a corrupt police chief in Surabaya who had been working with arms dealers. It was a dangerous trade, but it was enough to convince the smuggler to get him on a boat. The journey was treacherous. The sea was unforgiving, and every wave felt like a reminder that death was never far behind. But Sun made it. He stepped onto Indonesian soil under a new name, carrying nothing but the weight of his sins. Yet, even as he disappeared into the crowded streets of Jakarta, he knew this was far from over. Harun's people would never stop hunting him, and the blood he had spilled would never wash away. But Sun Liang had survived worse. And he wasn't about to stop now. Sun Liang knew better than to stay in one place for too long. Jakarta was a city of chaos and anonymity, perfect for hiding, but not for surviving indefinitely. He needed a new plan, a way to disappear completely. His first move was securing a fake identity. Through his years in the underworld, he had made contacts in every major city across Southeast Asia, and Jakarta was no exception. He found his way to a man named Yusuf, an expert in forging documents, changing names, and making ghosts out of criminals. "You need a new passport, a new face, and a new life," Yusuf said, inspecting Sun's appearance like a sculptor studying raw material. "That'll cost you." Sun had already anticipated this. He had no money, no assets, but he had something even more valuable, information. "There's a warehouse in Medan," Sun said, his voice low, "run by a syndicate moving illegal firearms. The Indonesian authorities don't know about it, but Harun Putra's people do. Give them the tip, and they'll burn it to the ground." Yusuf's eyes narrowed. He wasn't a man easily impressed, but he knew the weight of what Sun was offering. With a single phone call, he could turn a small war between crime syndicates into a bloodbath. He nodded. "Come back tomorrow," Yusuf said. "Your new life will be ready." Sun spent the night in a rundown guest house, the kind where no one asked questions. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily, his mind racing. He had been on the run before, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't just running from a single enemy. He was running from an entire world that wanted him dead. By morning, he had his new documents. His name was now Andy Rahman, a Malaysian businessman with a history of frequent travel. The passport was flawless, the kind that could pass any inspection. He also had a local ID, a bank account, and even a fake employment record. But a new name wasn't enough. He needed to leave Jakarta. With his new identity, he booked a ticket to Bali under the pretense of business travel. The airport was a risk, but with the chaos of tourists and the efficiency of his new documents, he slipped through unnoticed. As the plane took off, Sun Liang, or Andy Rahman, exhaled a slow breath. He wasn't safe yet, but he had bought himself time. What he didn't know was that someone had already picked up his trail. A single mistake, a small oversight, and the hunt had begun again. Sun Liang had always known that escape was a temporary state. He had spent years evading capture, moving from one country to another, shedding old identities and adopting new ones. Yet, the walls were closing in. In Bali, the streets pulsed with life, tourists basking in the sun, locals weaving through the chaos of markets and motorbikes. But beneath the surface, danger lurked in the shadows. He knew that the men hunting him were relentless. They would not stop. They had resources, connections, and the kind of patience that turned fugitives into ghosts. His meeting with the fixer had confirmed his fears. There was no safe haven. His past had finally caught up with him. He moved through the city with caution, slipping into the anonymity of crowds, his mind constantly calculating his next step. The weight of his crimes clung to him like a second skin, a reminder that no matter how far he ran, the blood he had spilled would always leave a trail. He relocated to a different hotel under a different name, ensuring that no pattern could be traced. His days were spent planning, gathering intelligence, identifying possible routes of escape. But even the best-laid plans had weaknesses. Every airport, every border crossing, every sea route carried the risk of exposure. His name was no longer just whispered in back rooms. It was written on lists held by dangerous people. As night fell, he remained awake, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. He scanned the encrypted messages that detailed movements of his pursuers. They were close, closer than he had expected. Somewhere in the city, someone had recognized him. A single slip was all it took. The realization settled over him like a tightening noose. He had to act fast. Tomorrow, he would disappear again. If he failed, there would be no second chance. Case 9. In the late 1970s, a series of heinous crimes shocked the United States, committed by a man who managed to conceal his malevolent nature behind a facade of charm and normalcy. Rodney Alcala, later infamously known as the dating game killer, led a double life that left a trail of devastation across the country. Born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucher on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, Alcala's early life was marked by turbulence. After his father abandoned the family, his mother relocated them to Los Angeles. Alcala joined the U.S. Army in 1960, but was discharged after a nervous breakdown, during which he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. This diagnosis, however, did little to deter him from pursuing higher education. He graduated from UCLA School of Fine Arts and later attended New York University under the alias John Berger. Alcala's criminal activities began in 1968 when he lured an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro into his Hollywood apartment. A concerned motorist witnessed the abduction and alerted police, who arrived to find Shapiro alive but brutally assaulted. Alcala evaded capture by fleeing to the East Coast, adopting a new identity, and enrolling in film school. During this period, he secured a counseling job at a New Hampshire arts camp for children, using the name John Berger. In 1971, Alcala was arrested after being recognized from a wanted poster. Extradited to California, he faced charges related to the Shapiro assault. However, due to the family's reluctance to have their daughter testify, prosecutors could not pursue the most severe charges. Alcala pleaded guilty to a lesser offense and served a brief prison sentence. Upon release, his predatory behavior escalated. Between 1977 and 1979, Alcala's spree intensified. He lured young women and girls, often posing as a professional photographer, and subjected them to unspeakable acts before ending their lives. His victims ranged in age from 12 to 28, and their bodies were discovered in various locations across California and New York. Despite his growing list of victims, Alcala managed to elude law enforcement, partly due to his unassuming demeanor and ability to blend into society. A chilling testament to his duplicitous nature occurred in 1978 when Alcala appeared on the popular television show The Dating Game. Introduced as a successful photographer, he charmed the audience and the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, who chose him as her date. However, Bradshaw later declined to go out with him, citing an unsettling feeling she couldn't ignore. This public appearance, juxtaposed with his clandestine atrocities, highlighted the stark contrast between his public persona and his hidden monstrosity. Alcala's downfall began with the disappearance of 12-year-old Robin Samso in 1979. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Alcala's description talking to her before she vanished. Her remains were discovered 12 days later in the Los Angeles foothills. A subsequent search of Alcala's storage locker in Seattle uncovered a trove of photographs of young women and a pair of earrings belonging to Samso. This evidence led to his arrest and conviction. Over the years, Alcala was tried multiple times, with convictions overturned on technicalities. However, advancements in DNA technology eventually linked him to several other murders, solidifying his guilt. In 2010, he was sentenced to death for 5 murders in California. While on death row, Alcala was extradited to New York, where he pleaded guilty to 2 additional homicides. Authorities suspect his involvement in numerous other cases, given the cache of photographs found in his possession. Rodney Alcala's story serves as a grim reminder of the potential for evil lurking behind a veneer of normalcy. His ability to charm and manipulate, combined with a relentless predatory instinct, allowed him to perpetrate horrific crimes over more than a decade. The enduring impact of his actions continues to resonate, underscoring the importance of vigilance and the relentless pursuit of justice for victims of such unimaginable atrocities. As authorities delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a disturbing reality. Rodney Alcala had been a master of deception, evading capture for years through a mix of charm, intelligence, and calculated manipulation. Investigators began meticulously piecing together his movements, trying to understand how a man who had been arrested and imprisoned multiple times managed to continue his killing spree across multiple states. One of the most chilling aspects of Alcala's crimes was his collection of photographs. When detectives searched his rented storage unit in Seattle, they found hundreds of images of young women and children, some smiling, others appearing uneasy, as if caught in a moment of realization. Many of these individuals were never identified, leaving a haunting question. How many more victims had fallen prey to him? Police released a selection of these images to the public in hopes that families might recognize missing loved ones, and tragically, some were indeed linked to unsolved cases stretching back years. The forensic evidence against Alcala grew stronger with time. Advances in DNA technology in the late 1990s and early 2000s connected him to previously unsolved murders in California, New York, and potentially even beyond. The pattern of his crimes became more evident. He would lure his victims by pretending to be a photographer, promising them glamour and fame. Once alone, he would subject them to horrifying abuse before ending their lives in some of the most brutal ways imaginable. His intelligence was another factor that prolonged his ability to elude capture. Alcala was highly articulate and even represented himself in court at one of his trials. During these proceedings, he played mind games with the jury, even questioning witnesses himself. At one point, he bizarrely asked a criminologist who was testifying against him, "Do you think I did it?" A moment that left the courtroom in stunned silence. Despite his attempts to manipulate the justice system, the overwhelming evidence ensured his conviction. By 2010, he was sentenced to death for 5 murders in California. Yet even then, law enforcement agencies suspected his true body count was far higher. While in custody, Alcala was extradited to New York, where he pleaded guilty to 2 additional murders. He was also linked to a case in Wyoming, and investigators in other states began re-examining cold cases that bore similarities to his crimes. For the families of his victims, justice came too late, but there was at least a sense of closure. Many of them had spent decades searching for answers, only to discover that their loved ones had fallen into the hands of a ruthless predator. Parents, siblings, and friends spoke of their loss, describing the deep wounds that never truly healed. The case of Robin Samso, the 12-year-old girl whose murder had ultimately led to Alcala's capture, remained one of the most heartbreaking. Her mother spent years fighting to keep his convictions intact, enduring multiple retrials and legal setbacks. Alcala's legacy remains one of horror. His case is often cited in criminal psychology courses as an example of a psychopath who weaponized charm and deception to evade justice. His appearance on the dating game remains one of the most unsettling moments in television history. A serial killer smiling on national television while, unbeknownst to the world, bodies were piling up. By the time of his death in 2021, Rodney Alcala had spent decades behind bars, but the full extent of his crimes may never be known. The photographs he left behind still hold secrets, and there are families still waiting for answers. His story serves as a chilling reminder that some of the most dangerous individuals do not lurk in the shadows but walk among us, hidden behind friendly smiles and disarming words. As Rodney Alcala sat in his prison cell, the weight of his crimes stretched far beyond the walls that confined him. Law enforcement agencies across the United States continued their efforts to link him to unsolved cases, believing that his true number of victims was far greater than those for which he had been convicted. Each year, new evidence surfaced, and families of missing persons came forward, desperate to know if their loved ones had been among those who had fallen prey to him. The photographs discovered in his Seattle storage unit became an ongoing mystery. The images, numbering in the hundreds, captured women and children, some looking directly into the camera, others caught in moments of unease. Despite the passage of time, authorities periodically released batches of these photographs, urging the public to help identify the individuals in them. Some families recognized their daughters, sisters, and friends. Others remained unclaimed, frozen in time, their fates unknown. The possibility that Alcala had left behind a trail of undiscovered victims haunted investigators, leading them to reopen cases that had gone cold for decades. One of the most disturbing aspects of Alcala's methods was his ability to blend into society. He had an uncanny ability to make people trust him, luring women into a false sense of security with promises of modeling opportunities. His background in fine arts and photography gave him the perfect cover. He moved through different states, leaving bodies in his wake, yet each time he managed to avoid suspicion for years. In the years following his conviction, forensic experts continued working tirelessly to connect DNA evidence from various crime scenes to Alcala. By 2011, he had been charged with additional murders, including 2 women killed in New York in the 1970s. As technology advanced, genetic genealogy and improved forensic techniques led to further discoveries. In 2021, just months before his death, authorities linked him to the murder of a woman in Wyoming, whose body had been found in 1982. Investigators suspected there were even more victims, but time was running out to uncover the full extent of his crimes. Meanwhile, the families of the victims lived with a grief that never truly faded. Many of them had spent years searching for answers, only to receive the devastating confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered by a man who had shown no remorse. Court proceedings were emotionally grueling, forcing families to relive their trauma while Alcala sat before them, sometimes even smirking as they described the pain he had inflicted. His ability to manipulate the justice system, winning appeals, forcing retrials, and delaying justice, only added to their suffering. One of the most infamous moments in Alcala's case remained his appearance on the dating game. The thought of a serial killer being introduced as a charming, eligible bachelor on national television was a chilling reminder of how easily he had fooled those around him. His victim count was rising even as he laughed and flirted with the game show's host and contestants. Cheryl Bradshaw, the woman who had chosen him as her date, later recalled feeling an immediate sense of unease after the show ended. She refused to go on the date, unknowingly saving her own life. By the time of his death in 2021, Alcala had spent decades in prison, sentenced to death multiple times over. Yet, for many, his passing did not bring closure. His crimes left an irreversible scar on the families of his victims and on the justice system itself. The photographs he left behind, filled with unknown faces, remained an ongoing mystery, leading investigators to believe that his true number of victims might never be fully known. Rodney Alcala's story serves as a grim reminder of how serial killers can move undetected in society, hiding in plain sight. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleyways. He was an intelligent, educated man who used charm and deceit as his weapons. His ability to manipulate those around him allowed him to evade justice for years, leaving devastation in his wake. Even now, long after his death, the search for his victims continues. Investigators still receive new leads, families still wait for answers, and forensic experts continue analyzing evidence in the hopes of uncovering the full truth. The legacy of Rodney Alcala is one of horror, deception, and an unsettling reminder that true evil often wears a friendly face. Case 10. Ted Bundy was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, a man whose charm and intelligence masked a deeply depraved nature. Born Theodore Robert Bundy on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, his early life was marked by secrecy and deception. He was raised by his grandparents under the belief that his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was actually his sister. This revelation, which he discovered later in life, may have contributed to his psychological turmoil. Despite an outwardly normal childhood, Bundy exhibited disturbing behavior from an early age, including a fascination with knives and an inability to connect emotionally with others. As he grew older, Bundy cultivated an image of himself as an ambitious and charismatic young man. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied psychology and later attempted to pursue a law degree. He was known for his ability to blend seamlessly into social circles, often using his charm to manipulate those around him. However, beneath this facade, Bundy harbored violent tendencies that would soon manifest in horrifying ways. Bundy's killing spree began in the early 1970s, targeting young women in several states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and Florida. His modus operandi was chillingly effective. He would often feign injury, using a cast or crutches to appear vulnerable, or impersonate a law enforcement officer to lure his victims into his car. Once he gained their trust, he would abduct, assault, and murder them, often returning to crime scenes to engage in necrophilic acts. His victims were predominantly college students, chosen for their youth and beauty, and his ability to evade capture made him one of the most elusive criminals of his time. The sheer number of his victims remains unknown, though Bundy eventually confessed to over 30 murders. However, law enforcement officials suspect the actual number to be significantly higher, possibly exceeding 100. His crimes were meticulously planned, and he was adept at covering his tracks. Unlike many serial killers, Bundy had no single fixed location for his crimes, making it difficult for authorities to connect the murders initially. Bundy's ability to evade capture was almost as notorious as his crimes. His deep understanding of law enforcement procedures, combined with his intelligence and adaptability, allowed him to stay ahead of investigators for years. He changed his appearance frequently, used stolen identification, and exploited legal loopholes to escape justice. Even when he was eventually apprehended in Utah in 1975 for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault, Bundy managed to escape twice from custody. First by jumping from a second-story courthouse window, and later by sawing a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell. During his time as a fugitive, Bundy continued his spree of violence, culminating in the brutal attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in 1978. In a matter of minutes, Bundy bludgeoned and strangled multiple victims, leaving behind a horrific crime scene that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He was arrested soon after and charged with multiple murders. This time, authorities ensured he would not escape again. Bundy's trial was one of the most sensationalized in American history. It was one of the first cases to receive extensive media coverage, with cameras in the courtroom broadcasting every moment to a captivated audience. Bundy, always eager for attention, chose to represent himself in court, using his legal knowledge to delay proceedings and manipulate the system. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming, including eyewitness testimonies, forensic evidence, and a distinct bite mark that matched his dental impressions. In 1979, Bundy was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, he exhausted every possible legal avenue to delay his execution, even offering to provide additional details about his crimes in exchange for clemency. His final confessions came in the days leading up to his execution, as he admitted to numerous murders that had long remained unsolved. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Crowds gathered outside the prison, celebrating the death of a man who had terrorized the nation for years. Despite his execution, Bundy's legacy continues to haunt criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts. His case remains one of the most extensively studied examples of psychopathy and serial murder, offering insights into the mind of a killer who was able to manipulate and deceive those around him with terrifying ease. His story serves as a chilling reminder that true evil can often wear the mask of normalcy, hiding in plain sight. Ted Bundy's case is not only one of the most infamous serial killer stories in American history, but also a prime example of how manipulation, charm, and a complete lack of remorse can allow a criminal to evade justice for years. His crimes spanned multiple states, and his ability to exploit legal systems, media attention, and even personal relationships made him one of the most enigmatic and dangerous criminals of the 20th century. To fully understand the extent of Bundy's depravity, it's essential to examine the details of his early life, his methods of killing, his psychological profile, his multiple arrests and escapes, his trial, and his eventual execution. Bundy was born to a single mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, in 1946. His mother was just 22 years old when she gave birth to him at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. To avoid societal shame, her family decided to raise Ted as their own child, while Eleanor was introduced to him as his older sister. This deception would later have a profound effect on Bundy, particularly when he discovered the truth about his origins. From a young age, Bundy exhibited signs of antisocial behavior. While many remember him as a well-mannered and intelligent child, those who knew him more intimately noticed something unsettling about him. He displayed an unusual interest in violence, enjoyed scaring people for his own amusement, and showed no remorse for his actions. His childhood lacked significant emotional connections, and as he grew older, he became more adept at masking his true self under a charming and seemingly normal exterior. Despite this, Bundy excelled academically. He attended the University of Puget Sound and later transferred to the University of Washington, where he studied psychology. Ironically, while studying human behavior, Bundy was secretly refining his ability to manipulate and deceive others. At one point, he even worked for a crisis hotline where he provided guidance to troubled individuals, an eerie contrast to the violent double life he would later lead. It wasn't until his romantic life took a hit that Bundy's violent tendencies began to surface. His first serious girlfriend, a wealthy and sophisticated woman, broke up with him after realizing he lacked ambition. This rejection seemed to ignite a deep-seated rage in Bundy. Many criminologists believe this event served as a catalyst for his later crimes, as many of his victims closely resembled his former girlfriend. Bundy's first confirmed murders began in 1974, though it is suspected that he had killed before then. His pattern was consistent. He targeted young, attractive women, often those with long, dark hair parted in the middle. His method of luring victims was calculated and effective. He would pretend to be injured, using a fake arm cast or crutches, and approach young women asking for help. Once they were close enough, he would overpower them, often using a blunt object to render them unconscious before taking them to a secluded location where he would assault and ultimately kill them. Throughout 1974, Bundy's crimes escalated. In Washington, he kidnapped and murdered several women, including Linda and Healy, a University of Washington student. That same year, in broad daylight, he abducted 2 women from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses saw him approaching women under the name Ted, which ultimately provided investigators with one of their first critical leads. Bundy's crimes spread across multiple states, including Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. He adapted quickly, using different tactics to avoid suspicion. Sometimes, he would impersonate a police officer or a firefighter, exploiting public trust to lure victims into his car. His ability to blend into different social environments made him nearly invisible to law enforcement for years. Bundy was finally arrested in August 1975 when a Utah police officer stopped him for erratic driving. A search of his vehicle revealed handcuffs, a crowbar, an ice pick, and other suspicious items. This led to his initial charge of aggravated kidnapping, but it wasn't enough to connect him to the murders just yet. However, as investigations continued, Bundy was linked to multiple disappearances across different states. He was transferred to Colorado to stand trial, but in 1977, he managed to escape from the courthouse library by jumping from a second-story window. He was recaptured within days, only to escape again, this time from his jail cell by sawing through the ceiling and crawling into the ventilation system. This second escape led to one of Bundy's most violent rampages. After fleeing Colorado, he made his way to Florida, where he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in January 1978. Within a matter of minutes, he brutally attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them and leaving the others severely injured. He then fled the scene and days later, abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. Bundy was finally captured in February 1978 after being stopped for driving a stolen car. By this point, law enforcement agencies across multiple states had been desperately searching for him, and his arrest brought an end to one of the most infamous killing sprees in U.S. history. Bundy's trial became a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, and television cameras broadcasted the proceedings nationwide. Bundy, always seeking control, chose to represent himself, believing he could outmaneuver the prosecution. His arrogance, however, proved to be his downfall. Despite his attempts to manipulate the jury and the public, the evidence against him was overwhelming. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a bite mark found on one of his victims, which matched his dental impressions. In 1979, Bundy was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, he exhausted every possible legal maneuver to delay his execution, even offering to confess to additional murders in exchange for more time. However, in January 1989, his time ran out. On January 24th, Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside the prison, hundreds of people gathered to celebrate his death, holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn." The public reaction reflected the immense fear and horror Bundy had inflicted upon the nation. Even after his execution, Bundy's case remains one of the most studied in criminal psychology. His ability to lead a double life, posing as a charismatic, intelligent individual while committing horrific crimes, has fascinated psychologists and law enforcement experts for decades. Bundy's case also changed the way law enforcement agencies handle serial killers. His crimes highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation, forensic advancements, and psychological profiling. The FBI's behavioral science unit used Bundy's case as a pivotal study in understanding serial killers, and his interviews have provided invaluable insights into the minds of similar offenders. What made Bundy so terrifying was not just his crimes, but his ability to deceive. He was not the stereotypical monster people expect. He was articulate, educated, and personable. His case serves as a reminder that evil does not always appear in an obvious form. Even today, Ted Bundy's name remains synonymous with psychological manipulation, deception, and horror. His crimes left an indelible mark on American history, forever changing the way society perceives serial killers. One of the most chilling aspects of Ted Bundy's case is his ability to manipulate those around him. He was not the typical image of a deranged murderer, unkempt, unstable, and easily recognizable as dangerous. Instead, Bundy was clean-cut, articulate, and charming, traits that allowed him to blend seamlessly into society. His intelligence and calculated demeanor made him a master at deception, allowing him to evade law enforcement for years. Bundy's ability to mask his true nature was a key factor in his prolonged killing spree. Many of his victims willingly followed him to their deaths, not realizing they were stepping into a predator's trap. He often feigned injury, appearing harmless and in need of help, and unsuspecting young women fell for the ruse. This psychological tactic, known as the Good Samaritan approach, played on human empathy, a cruel irony given the merciless brutality he later inflicted on his victims. Bundy also manipulated the legal system to his advantage. His self-representation in court was not only an attempt to control his own fate, but also a way to maintain the illusion of superiority over the system. Even behind bars, he continued his psychological games, misleading investigators and delaying justice by offering confessions on his own terms. His manipulative nature extended to personal relationships, as he managed to maintain a romantic relationship and even marry a woman while incarcerated. This ability to persuade others to see him as more than a killer only added to the chilling nature of his crimes. Bundy's crimes coincided with a period of significant advancements in forensic science and criminal profiling. Before his capture, law enforcement agencies across different states had difficulty connecting his crimes due to the lack of a centralized database. His case highlighted the urgent need for better communication between agencies, leading to improvements in information sharing and the establishment of national crime databases. One of the most crucial pieces of forensic evidence that led to Bundy's conviction was the bite mark analysis from his attack on Lisa Levy, one of the Chi Omega victims. The impression left on her body matched Bundy's dental structure, providing irrefutable evidence in court. While bite mark analysis has since become a controversial forensic method, at the time, it was a breakthrough in securing Bundy's conviction. Additionally, Bundy's case played a significant role in the development of behavioral profiling within the FBI. His interviews with law enforcement provided invaluable insights into the mind of a serial killer. The FBI's behavioral science unit used his case as a foundational study in understanding the motivations and psychological patterns of similar offenders. His admissions, though often cryptic and manipulative, helped law enforcement refine profiling techniques that would later be used to catch other notorious serial killers. Few criminals have had as lasting an impact on popular culture as Ted Bundy. His case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films. The fascination with Bundy stems not only from the horror of his crimes, but also from the paradox of his personality. How someone so outwardly normal could be capable of such evil. The media played a significant role in shaping Bundy's public image. During his trial, he received an unusual amount of attention, with news networks covering his case extensively. His confidence in front of the cameras, coupled with his bizarre attempts to charm the public, made his trial one of the most watched in American history. Some women even found themselves drawn to him, sending him fan mail and expressing their admiration, a disturbing phenomenon that underscores the power of psychological manipulation. Hollywood has also capitalized on Bundy's story, with multiple films and TV adaptations attempting to capture his dual nature. From documentaries like Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes to dramatized films like Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, his story continues to captivate audiences. However, these portrayals often raise ethical questions about the glamorization of serial killers and the impact such media representations have on public perception. Bundy's case left an indelible mark on how serial killers are investigated. His ability to evade capture for so long revealed flaws in law enforcement coordination, leading to significant changes in investigative techniques. The case reinforced the importance of forensic science, behavioral analysis, and interdepartmental cooperation in tracking criminals across state lines. Additionally, Bundy's profile has been used in training law enforcement officers on the psychology of serial offenders. His case is frequently cited in criminology courses and forensic psychology programs as an example of how charm and manipulation can be used as weapons by dangerous individuals. Even decades after his execution, Bundy's legacy remains relevant in discussions about criminal justice, psychology, and media ethics. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating individuals who seem outwardly normal, but harbor a darkness beneath the surface. His ability to deceive those around him, exploit the legal system, and evade justice for so long makes his case one of the most studied and unsettling in American history. Case 11. The legend of the Bunny Man has haunted the state of Virginia for decades, its origins buried beneath layers of folklore and fact. At first glance, it sounds like nothing more than a ghost story, an escaped asylum inmate dressed in a rabbit costume, attacking people with an axe under the cover of night. But dig deeper, and you'll find that the myth is rooted in real events, incidents that remain unexplained to this day. It all began in the fall of 1970. Fairfax County, Virginia, was a quiet, wooded region, far removed from the hustle of Washington, D.C., but not untouched by strange occurrences. On October 19, 1970, Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée were sitting in a parked car on Guinea Road, near Burke, Virginia. They were enjoying the stillness of the evening when something crashed into the front passenger window. Shattered glass flew in every direction, and before they could react, a man stood before them, dressed in white, long ears protruding from his hood. The figure wielded a hatchet. His voice was calm but menacing. "You're on private property," he reportedly said. "You're trespassing. If you come back, I'll kill you." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished into the darkness. The shaken couple reported the encounter to the police, describing the attacker as a man dressed in a bunny costume. Officers searched the area but found nothing, no footprints, no sign of the attacker. It was an unsettling but seemingly isolated event. But 10 days later, on October 29th, another incident occurred. Security guard Paul Phillips was patrolling a construction site in Kings Park West, Fairfax County, when he spotted a man standing on the porch of a half-built house. Even from a distance, something seemed off. The man was dressed in white, with long ears resembling those of a rabbit. Phillips approached, calling out for him to leave the site. The figure did not respond. Instead, he lifted an axe and began hacking away at one of the porch beams. Splinters flew with every strike. As Phillips drew closer, the man turned to face him and shouted, "You're trespassing. If you come any closer, I'll chop your head off." Startled, Phillips backed away and ran for help. By the time police arrived, the man had disappeared into the woods, leaving behind nothing but deep gouges in the wood where his axe had struck. The incident sparked widespread panic. The local newspapers ran headlines about the mysterious Bunny Man, and Fairfax County residents grew wary of venturing out at night. Rumors spread. Some claimed he was an escaped mental patient. Others said he was the ghost of a man who had been wrongfully executed. The more the stories circulated, the more elaborate they became. Soon, whispers of mutilated bodies and ritualistic killings made their way into the legend. Authorities investigated, but the Bunny Man was never caught. Over the years, more sightings trickled in. Figures in white lurking near abandoned buildings, axe marks found on bridges, the eerie sound of laughter echoing through the trees. The legend only grew stronger with time. One particular place became synonymous with the myth, Bunny Man Bridge. Officially known as Colchester Overpass, this isolated railway bridge in Clifton, Virginia, became the focal point of local ghost stories. People claimed that on Halloween night, if you stood beneath the bridge at midnight, you could hear the Bunny Man's voice whispering through the wind, or worse, see his shadow watching from the treetops. Skeptics dismissed the tale as urban legend, a ghost story born from a combination of real-life events and overactive imaginations. But even now, decades later, something about the Bunny Man still lingers. Those who visit the bridge at night report an overwhelming sense of unease, as if something unseen is watching from the darkness. Some claim to have heard faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of an axe against stone. Whether the Bunny Man was ever real or simply a figment of fear, his story remains one of Virginia's most chilling mysteries. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones we see, but the ones that refuse to be found. As time passed, the legend of the Bunny Man evolved, growing darker with each retelling. What had started as bizarre but seemingly harmless encounters escalated into something more sinister. People whispered about disappearances near the bridge, about hikers who ventured too far into the woods and were never seen again. Whether these tales had any basis in reality was difficult to determine, but the fear they instilled was undeniable. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, local teenagers dared each other to visit Bunny Man Bridge on Halloween night. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures lurking near the overpass, while others swore they heard whispers in the wind, low, guttural sounds, like someone breathing just behind them. More than one person reported finding strange carvings on trees near the bridge. Crude drawings of rabbits, sometimes with their heads missing, their bodies marked with deep, jagged slashes. In 1987, a group of high school students decided to test the legend for themselves. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they hiked into the dense woods surrounding the bridge, determined to prove that the Bunny Man was nothing more than a scary story. They laughed at the idea of an axe-wielding madman in a rabbit suit, dismissing it as pure fiction. But as the night stretched on, their laughter faded. The deeper they went into the trees, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. One of the students, a boy named Eric, later recounted what happened next. He said they heard a rustling sound in the bushes, followed by the distant crack of a branch snapping underfoot. At first, they assumed it was an animal, but then came the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, ragged, and deliberate. Eric turned his flashlight toward the noise, but the beam revealed nothing. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and died. Panic set in. The group turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of heavy breathing seemed to follow them. By the time they reached the bridge, they were gasping for air, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They piled into their cars and sped away, convinced that someone, had been stalking them in the woods that night. In the years that followed, more reports of strange occurrences around Bunny Man Bridge surfaced. A man walking his dog near the area claimed to have seen a figure crouched in the shadows beneath the overpass. When he called out, the figure stood, its silhouette distorted by the moonlight, its elongated ears casting eerie shapes against the stone. The man fled, his dog barking wildly as they disappeared down the road. Another chilling account came from a group of paranormal investigators who set up recording equipment near the bridge. They hoped to capture evidence of supernatural activity, but what they found was far more disturbing. When they played back their recordings, they heard what sounded like faint whispers layered beneath the white noise. The words were garbled, but one phrase stood out clearly: "Get out." Despite these stories, skeptics insisted that the Bunny Man was nothing more than an urban legend, a case of mass hysteria fueled by campfire tales and overactive imaginations. They pointed to the lack of concrete evidence, the absence of any real proof beyond anecdotal accounts. But even they could not deny the bridge's unsettling reputation, nor could they explain the unshakable feeling of dread that seemed to settle over anyone who spent too much time there. In an attempt to separate fact from fiction, local historian Brian Conley conducted an extensive investigation into the origins of the Bunny Man legend. His research revealed something unexpected. There was no record of an escaped asylum patient in Fairfax County, nor was there any evidence of a serial killer dressed as a rabbit. However, Conley did uncover newspaper articles from 1970 detailing the original Bunny Man sightings, the reports made by Robert Bennett and Paul Phillips. The incidents were real, even if the man behind them was never found. What became of the Bunny Man? No one knows for certain. Some believe he was a drifter, an unhinged recluse who took pleasure in terrifying others before vanishing into the wilderness. Others think he was an ordinary man who, for reasons unknown, chose to hide behind the mask of an urban legend. And then there are those who swear he was something else entirely, something beyond explanation, a specter born from fear itself. Today, Bunny Man Bridge remains a place of mystery, its legend woven into the fabric of Virginia's folklore. Visitors still make pilgrimages to the site, some in search of a thrill, others hoping to glimpse a shadow of the past. And though the rational mind insists that there is nothing to fear, those who stand beneath the overpass at midnight cannot shake the feeling that they are not alone. Perhaps the Bunny Man was never real, or perhaps even now he watches from the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stray too close to his domain. The legend of the Bunny Man didn't fade as time passed. Instead, it grew, whispered among children at sleepovers, spoken in hushed tones by teenagers daring each other to visit the infamous Colchester overpass, and even analyzed by local historians trying to separate fact from fiction. But some stories were never meant to be untangled. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, a series of disappearances were reported around Fairfax County and nearby areas of Clifton, Virginia. Hikers, drifters, and even a handful of university students were last seen near the heavily wooded trails that line the roads near the overpass. Their vehicles were found abandoned, doors flung open as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Some cars had deep gashes along their exteriors, long slashes in the metal, as though made by something not quite human. One of the most disturbing cases involved a young couple, Jason and Emily, who were last seen driving home from a party. Witnesses recalled seeing them leave in good spirits, heading in the direction of Clifton. The following morning, their vehicle was discovered on the side of the road, just a few miles from the overpass. The car's interior was smeared with blood, but there was no sign of Jason or Emily. Only a torn piece of white fabric, resembling rabbit fur, was found near the back seat. Police investigations led nowhere. No footprints, no drag marks, no leads. The case joined a growing list of unexplained vanishings, each one eerily tied to the same silent, brooding forest surrounding the infamous bridge. Locals became wary of the area. Those who dared to investigate, amateur ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and reckless teenagers, often returned with strange tales. Some spoke of a figure in white darting between the trees. Others claimed to have seen dark, hollowed-out eyes staring from the depths of the forest. More chillingly, a few claimed to hear scraping sounds against their car windows late at night, as if something was testing the glass or waiting for them to step outside. In 1986, an old gas station attendant near the outskirts of town claimed to have seen something, or someone, on a particularly foggy night. He had been closing up for the evening when he noticed a lone figure standing at the edge of the gas station lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. The figure wore a rabbit mask, its long ears torn and jagged, its fur stained with something dark. The mask was too large, sitting eerily off-kilter on the person's head. The mouthpiece was stretched into a grotesque, toothy grin. The figure stood motionless, watching. The attendant, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, quickly locked up and left. Yet as he drove off, he swore he saw the thing start to move, stepping slowly onto the road. Its gaze locked on him until he vanished from sight. Others soon reported similar sightings. A man in a ragged white suit, wielding a hatchet, lingering near the bridge at night. Mutilated animal carcasses, rabbits mostly, left hanging from trees near the overpass, their bodies slashed open with precise, surgical-like cuts. Some speculated that the original Bunny Man, if he ever truly existed, had been replaced by a copycat, someone who had taken the urban legend too seriously. But others weren't so sure. In the early 1990s, an abandoned farmhouse deep in the woods, about 4 miles from the overpass, was accidentally discovered by a group of hikers. The house had been overtaken by nature, vines weaving in and out of broken windows, its wooden structure rotting away. Inside, however, was something deeply disturbing. The walls were covered in bizarre carvings, crude depictions of rabbits, human figures, and strange symbols that no one could quite decipher. The floorboards were stained dark, the air thick with a pungent metallic scent. But the most unsettling discovery was a pile of shredded clothing, seemingly belonging to multiple individuals, along with clumps of white fur scattered across the floor. The house was later linked to a missing persons case from 1979, when a family of 4 vanished without a trace. While no bodies were found, local authorities decided to seal off the property, declaring it off-limits. The public was never informed of the full extent of what had been discovered inside. As years passed, the Bunny Man legend only grew, fueled by new sightings, unexplained phenomena, and the chilling reminders of the past. Some claim he was never real, just a story spun out of fear and folklore. Others believe he was once real, but is long gone, his crimes swallowed by time. And yet, a handful remain convinced that the Bunny Man never left. To this day, on Halloween night, thrill seekers still gather near the Colchester overpass, daring each other to stand beneath the bridge at midnight. Some claim to hear footsteps just beyond the trees. Others have reported strange figures lurking at the forest's edge, watching in silence. And every now and then, someone returns from the overpass with long, deep scratches along their car doors, the metal gouged as if by something sharp, something neither human nor entirely animal. The town of Clifton, despite its picturesque streets and peaceful atmosphere, remains haunted by the shadow of the Bunny Man. Whether he was a real murderer, an escaped lunatic, or simply a legend spun by terrified locals, one thing is certain: his presence lingers, woven into the very fabric of the town's history. And for those who still dare to seek him out, there is a warning passed down through generations. If you hear the scratching at your window, don't look. Don't open your door. And whatever you do, don't follow the white rabbit. Case 12. The legend of the Night Marchers, or Huakaipa, is one of Hawaii's most feared supernatural phenomena. Though widely regarded as folklore, there have been eerie incidents reported throughout the islands that make many believe the tales are more than just myths. The Night Marchers are said to be the ghostly apparitions of ancient Hawaiian warriors, marching in spectral formation under the cover of night. Their presence is a harbinger of doom to those who witness them, and the only way to survive an encounter is to lie face down in absolute submission, showing respect to the warriors of the past. One of the most chilling modern cases involving the Night Marchers took place in 2012 in Waipio Valley, Hawaii, a place known for its sacred sites and ancient battle history. The story centers around Daniel Kahale, a 37-year-old hiker and local historian who vanished without a trace while exploring the valley's deeper, less-traveled trails. Daniel was well-versed in Hawaiian legends, often sharing his knowledge with tourists and researchers. He believed in respecting the Aina, land, and the spirits that guarded it. Despite his deep understanding of Hawaiian traditions, Daniel was known for his skepticism towards supernatural claims. He often dismissed the stories of the Night Marchers as exaggerated folklore, insisting there was no documented proof that they existed. However, his final recorded message hinted at something much darker than mere legend. Daniel's journey into Waipio Valley was meant to be a 2-day excursion. He carried a GoPro camera to document his findings, and had planned to upload the footage to his small YouTube channel, where he discussed Hawaiian history. He sent his last message to a friend at 9:47 p.m., stating that he had set up camp near an ancient heiau temple, and that he had heard drumming in the distance. The next morning, Daniel's campsite was found completely untouched, his backpack, tent, and supplies still in place. His GoPro, which had been strapped to his chest, was discovered several feet away, partially buried in the mud. When authorities retrieved the footage, what they saw left even the most hardened investigators deeply unsettled. The footage begins as expected, Daniel speaking to the camera, narrating his exploration of Waipio Valley, describing ancient petroglyphs and burial caves. As night falls, the camera captures something unusual, a distant glow of torches moving in a straight line across the valley floor. Daniel's voice turns from curiosity to unease as the drums grow louder. He whispers into the camera that he's witnessing something that shouldn't be there. Then, the sound of chanting emerges from the darkness. The voices are deep, rhythmic, and commanding, resonating through the valley. Daniel, now visibly shaken, makes a crucial mistake. He stands up and watches instead of lying down, as Hawaiian legend dictates. The camera captures shadowy figures in full traditional armor, their eyes glowing an unnatural red. Their footsteps make no sound, yet their presence is undeniable. The footage ends abruptly as the camera topples to the ground, landing at an angle that captures the last fleeting moments of movement before all goes silent. Despite extensive searches, Daniel's body was never found. His footprints stopped abruptly near a sheer cliffside, with no signs of a struggle or fall. Search and rescue teams were baffled. There was no physical way he could have vanished without a trace. Hawaiian elders in the area were not surprised by the outcome. According to them, Daniel had disrespected the Night Marchers by watching them pass instead of showing the proper reverence. They warned that those who do not show respect either meet a swift death or are taken to the spirit world forever lost. To this day, locals claim that Daniel's presence can still be felt in Waipio Valley. Some hikers have reported hearing whispers near the heiau, and others claim to have seen a lone figure standing at the edge of the valley, disappearing whenever someone approaches. Daniel's story remains one of the most unsettling disappearances in Hawaiian history, and whether one believes in the Night Marchers or not, his case serves as a haunting reminder that some legends are better left undisturbed. Daniel Kahale's disappearance sent shockwaves throughout the local community. Search and rescue teams combed the valley for weeks, using helicopters, K9 units, and infrared scanners, yet no trace of him was ever found. His family, devastated, refused to accept that he had simply vanished. Some believed he had fallen victim to the treacherous cliffs or the unpredictable waters of the valley's rivers, but others, especially those familiar with the island's spiritual history, were convinced that something far more sinister had occurred. Local kupuna elders, who had spent their lives in Waipio Valley, warned search parties not to look too deeply. They claimed that the Night Marchers do not leave behind victims in any physical sense. Instead, those who cross their path and fail to show respect are taken into the spirit world, never to be seen again. Some rescue workers, initially skeptical, began experiencing unusual events during their search. Batteries draining suddenly, GPS systems failing, and eerie, rhythmic drumming echoing through the valley at night. 3 days after the search was officially called off, a massive thunderstorm swept across the Big Island, bringing record-breaking rainfall and causing landslides in Waipio Valley. The heiau where Daniel had last camped was partially buried under mud and debris, as if nature itself was erasing any trace of what had happened. Lightning repeatedly struck the valley floor, an unusual occurrence even in Hawaii's storm-prone weather. The storm only deepened the belief that Daniel's fate was sealed by something beyond human understanding. Many saw it as a sign from the ancient spirits, a warning to never disturb their sacred paths again. Despite Daniel's disappearance, his story refused to fade. Hikers and local residents began reporting strange sightings in the months that followed. A lone figure standing at the valley's edge at sunset, only to disappear when approached. Whispers carried by the wind, calling out in an unrecognizable voice. Faint drumming at night, growing louder near the site of Daniel's last known location. One chilling account came from a group of tourists who visited the valley with a local guide. As they reached a lookout point, one of the tourists froze in place, staring into the distance. When asked what she saw, she described a row of shadowy figures carrying torches, walking in perfect formation across the valley floor. The guide, realizing what she was witnessing, immediately told everyone to kneel and avert their gaze. When the tourist tried to take a picture, her camera malfunctioned, deleting all images from her SD card. The group left in terrified silence. None of them spoke about what they saw again. Daniel's GoPro footage was carefully examined by forensic analysts, but what they found raised more questions than answers. The last 2 minutes of the recording contained audio distortions unlike anything they had encountered before. Experts described the interference as a low-frequency hum mixed with rhythmic drumming. But what disturbed them most was a deep, guttural voice that emerged near the end. Though difficult to make out, Hawaiian language specialists believed the voice was chanting an ancient war cry, one only used by Ali'i warriors preparing for battle. Even more unsettling, Daniel's own voice disappears in the final 30 seconds. He is clearly running, his breathing ragged, but his footsteps are completely silent. The final frame shows a shadow looming over the camera, its shape indistinct but clearly humanoid. The footage ends abruptly, as if the device had been forcefully turned off. The camera itself was sent to a research lab on the mainland for further analysis, but it mysteriously went missing during transit. Officials blamed a shipping error, but many believed the object was never meant to leave the island. Months after the search was over, Daniel's family received an anonymous letter, postmarked from Hilo. The letter contained only a few lines, written in Old Hawaiian script, a form of writing no longer in common use. Translated, it read, "The path was not yours to walk. The warriors have reclaimed what was theirs. Do not seek what is lost." No sender was ever identified. The handwriting did not match any known records. Local Hawaiian cultural practitioners took Daniel's case as a grim reminder of the power of the ancient spirits. They warned outsiders against treating sacred sites as mere tourist attractions. "These places are not meant to be disturbed," one elder said in an interview. "The old gods still walk among us. The night marchers are real, and those who forget their place will learn that the hard way." To this day, Waipio Valley remains a place of beauty, mystery, and fear. Some still search for logical explanations for Daniel Kahale's disappearance, but others believe the answer is clear. He crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and the night marchers, the eternal guardians of the land, ensured that he would never return. Those who visit the valley now tread carefully, never staying past sunset, never whistling in the dark, and never, ever looking directly at the marching figures if they appear. For the spirits of the past do not forget, and they do not forgive. Daniel Kahale's disappearance soon became more than just a tragic mystery. It became an urban legend. His name was whispered in hushed voices, a cautionary tale for those who dared challenge the ancient spirits of Hawaii. Despite warnings from elders, outsiders continued to search for answers, convinced there was a logical explanation for his vanishing. Yet, the more they searched, the stranger the case became. In the years following Daniel's disappearance, paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and filmmakers were drawn to Waipio Valley. Some wanted to prove the night marchers were real, while others aimed to debunk the stories. But many who ventured into the valley found more than they had bargained for. One documentary crew from the mainland spent a week in Waipio, hoping to capture evidence of supernatural activity. Their leader, a skeptic named James Holloway, dismissed the legends as primitive superstition, convinced that Daniel's case had a rational explanation. Perhaps an accidental fall, a wild animal attack, or even foul play. On the 5th night of filming, James and his crew camped near the remnants of the ancient heiau where Daniel had last been seen. Everything was fine until midnight. The crew's walkie-talkies crackled with static, despite clear weather. Their temperature gauges dropped suddenly, the air becoming unnaturally cold. The sound of drums echoed from the valley, deep and rhythmic, growing louder by the second. One of the cameramen, a young woman named Leah, described feeling an invisible force press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Then the cameras all shut off at once. Panicked, the crew grabbed their gear and fled to their vehicles. When they reviewed their footage the next morning, the final frames showed something inexplicable. A procession of shadowy figures, partially obscured by the night mist, moving in perfect unison. Their outlines were faint, almost like distortions in the air, but their glowing red eyes were unmistakable. James Holloway, who had spent years debunking the paranormal, never spoke about the incident again. He abandoned the documentary project entirely and refused to return to Hawaii. Not all encounters happened in the valley itself. One chilling account came from a local woman named Lonnie, who lived in a remote house on the cliffs above Waipio. She had grown up hearing the legends of the night marchers, but had never experienced anything unusual until one fateful evening. It started with a dream, one that felt more real than reality itself. In the dream, she stood at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the valley. Below her, a line of warriors marched in perfect formation, their torches illuminating the darkness. But as she watched, one of them turned its head and looked directly at her. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. But then, she realized something terrifying. The chanting from her dream was still happening. Outside her window, the distant sound of conch shells filled the air. The rhythmic pounding of feet echoed from the valley floor. And then she heard her name. A deep, guttural voice, impossibly ancient, whispered her name from the shadows outside her home. Frozen in fear, she did the only thing she could remember from childhood teachings. She threw herself onto the floor, face down, and shut her eyes tight. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. When she finally dared to look up, the only thing left was an eerie silence and a thick mist covering the valley below. While the stories and encounters with the night marchers continued, Daniel's mother, Leilani Kahale, never gave up hope that her son's fate could be understood. She met with priests, spiritual leaders, and even flew in paranormal researchers from the mainland. But no one could provide answers. Desperate, she sought the help of a Hawaiian kahuna, priest, known for his deep connection to the spirit world. He agreed to perform a sacred ritual, seeking guidance from the ancestors. During the ritual, as he chanted in the old tongue, Leilani felt a sudden pressure in the air, like something unseen had entered the room. The kahuna fell silent, his eyes wide with fear. After a long pause, he whispered, "Your son is with the warriors now. He cannot return." Leilani begged for an explanation, but the kahuna refused to say more. He only warned her never to disturb the spirits again. Heartbroken but accepting the truth, Leilani ceased all further searches. She left offerings at the edge of Waipio Valley, a lei of white flowers and a bowl of poi, a traditional Hawaiian dish, a final farewell to the son she would never see again. Daniel was not the last to disappear in Waipio. 3 years later, a 26-year-old tourist from California, Ryan Carter, went missing after camping in the valley. His friends reported that he had wandered off alone one evening, saying he wanted to feel the energy of the land. He never came back. Authorities conducted another extensive search. But just like with Daniel, no traces were found, no footprints, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. It was as if the valley had swallowed him whole. The last photo on his phone, retrieved from a cloud backup, was chilling, a dimly lit trail, disappearing into the mist, with faint, glowing lights hovering in the distance. Today, Waipio Valley remains as mysterious as ever. While many continue to visit, locals warn against disrespecting the land. The legends of the night marchers are not just myths, they are warnings. Do not walk the valley after sunset. Do not whistle at night. Do not challenge what you do not understand. For those who forget these rules, the warriors are still marching, and they do not leave survivors. Even now, on certain nights, when the mist rolls in and the wind is eerily still, you can hear them, the steady beat of drums, the distant calls of conch shells, and the unseen eyes watching from the darkness. And if you ever find yourself in Waipio Valley at the wrong time, remember this. Never look directly at them, never make a sound, and never, ever stand in their path. Case 13. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a chilling rumor began circulating throughout Chicago, particularly among children and teenagers. Stories of a mysterious figure dressed as a clown, lurking in parks and near schools, spread like wildfire. He wasn't a performer at birthday parties, nor was he a friendly figure handing out balloons. This was Homie the Clown, a sinister character who allegedly drove around in a white van, attempting to lure children inside. The legend took root in the predominantly African-American communities of Chicago's south and west sides. Parents whispered warnings to their children, teachers reinforced safety lessons, and kids shared terrifying accounts of near abductions. The name Homie itself seemed to originate from a popular television character on In Living Color, a sketch comedy show that featured a comedic yet rebellious clown named Homie D. Clown. However, the Homie haunting Chicago's streets was no laughing matter. Reports varied in detail. Some claimed he merely tried to scare kids for fun, while others told more sinister tales of attempted kidnappings. Schools sent out warnings and police increased their patrols, yet no official reports confirmed an actual abduction. The lack of solid evidence only added to the hysteria, making Homie the Clown more of a phantom than a man, a living urban legend. As the rumors grew, so did the fear. Parents refused to let their children walk home alone. Kids would huddle together, pointing at any white van that passed, their hearts racing with terror. The police, while acknowledging the community's concerns, struggled to verify the claims. Without concrete evidence, Homie the Clown became more of a specter of paranoia rather than a real threat. Psychologists studying the phenomenon suggested that Homie the Clown was a product of collective fear, amplified by word of mouth and media sensationalism. Urban legends thrive in environments where anxiety is already present, and during the late 1980s, crime rates in Chicago were high. Fear of child abductions was already a pressing concern, and Homie fit neatly into that pre-existing paranoia. Interestingly, this wasn't the first time a killer clown narrative had taken hold of the public's imagination. Just a decade prior, John Wayne Gacy, one of America's most infamous serial killers, had been arrested in Chicago. Gacy had performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties, creating a disturbing association between clowns and danger. Though Homie was likely a fictional creation, his image played into a deep-rooted cultural fear of clowns, known as coulrophobia. Despite the logical explanations, the sightings continued. Children claimed to see him standing near playgrounds, holding a sack, waving them over. Others insisted they heard him laughing from a distance, his face obscured by shadows. The line between reality and folklore blurred as the legend refused to die. Page 3. The Enduring Legacy. By the mid-1990s, the Homie the Clown panic began to fade. No real suspect was ever identified, and no evidence of attempted abduction surfaced. It was as if Homie had never existed outside of whispered warnings and schoolyard rumors. However, the story still lingered in Chicago's cultural memory. Parents who were children during that time now tell their own kids about the legend, keeping the tale alive. Urban legends like Homie the Clown serve as cautionary tales, reinforcing community values and safety precautions. Though he may not have been real, the fear he inspired was very much alive. The legend of Homie became a reflection of deeper societal anxieties, about child safety, about the unknown, and about the ever-present specter of real-life monsters that sometimes walk among us. Even today, the occasional whisper about Homie resurfaces, usually when an eerie figure is spotted near a school or an unfamiliar van lingers too long. In the digital age, similar legends spread online, evolving with the times, but the core lesson remains the same. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and beware of the things that lurk just beyond the reach of reason. Was Homie the Clown ever real? Perhaps not in the way people feared, but in the minds of those who lived through the panic, he will always remain a shadow in the dark, a figure just out of sight, waiting to return when the fear is needed once more. While the Homie the Clown legend faded from the public eye, its echoes still reverberate in Chicago's folklore. The legend left an imprint on those who grew up during its peak, and even today, some recall strange encounters that never quite faded from memory. Did they truly see Homie? Or was it the weight of collective fear that made them believe? The legend of Homie the Clown took on new life with the rise of internet forums and social media. Every few years, eerie photos circulate, grainy images of clowns standing beneath dimly lit street lamps, their faces frozen in unsettling grins. Pranks inspired by the myth occasionally spark new waves of panic, proving that Homie still lingers in the public consciousness. The 2016 killer clown phenomenon, where people dressed as sinister clowns to terrorize neighborhoods, bore an uncanny resemblance to Homie the Clown. It was as if the legend had been reborn in a digital age, proving that fear, once planted, never truly dies. Chicagoans who lived through the original Homie scare watched these modern clown sightings with a mix of nostalgia and unease. The cycle had come full circle. Beyond Chicago, similar urban legends persist. The boogeyman, the vanishing hitchhiker, the hook-handed killer. These myths thrive because they tap into universal fears. Homie the Clown was no different. He wasn't just a figure in a white van. He was the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare, every child's fear of the unknown. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Homie the Clown legend is the possibility that it wasn't entirely fiction. While no verifiable kidnappings were linked to him, the fear that spread was built on something real. Anxieties about safety, memories of past horrors, and a genuine distrust of the unknown. The absence of proof does not always mean the absence of danger. Today, when Chicagoans hear the whisper of Homie the Clown, they don't just remember the fear, they remember the lessons. Watch the streets, protect the children, and never, ever trust the man in the white van.